Welcome, weary wanderer, to the seemingly innocent suburbs of Elmore, where cartoon logic bends reality and childhood wonder masks deeper truths. Tonight, we'll explore the complete collection of the amazing world of Gumball's most unsettling tales, those episodes that linger in memory long after the credits roll. From psychological horror disguised as comedy to existential questions wrapped in colorful animation, we'll journey through the darker corners of this deceptively simple world. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we walk together through Elmore's shadows. There's no rush here. Just let these strange stories wash over you like whispered secrets in the dark. In the heart of Elmore, where the mundane and the magical intertwine like threads in a tapestry woven by hands that never learned the difference between reality and dream, there stands a house that looks exactly like every other house on the street, yet contains within its walls a family whose dysfunction runs so deep that it has become the very foundation upon which their love is built. This is the Watterson household, a place where the normal rules of family dynamics have been twisted into shapes that would make a psychologist weep and a philosopher question the very nature of what it means to belong to something larger than oneself. The story of this family begins not with their present circumstances, but with the choices that carved the pathways leading to their current state of beautiful, terrible codependency. Richard Watterson, the father and ostensible head of household, represents something far more disturbing than simple comic relief or lazy husband stereotype. He is a grown man who has been systematically infantilized to such a degree that his very existence has become a form of psychological imprisonment, both for himself and for those who have taken responsibility for his care. To understand Richard's condition, we must journey back through the layers of his personal history, peeling away the protective coating of humor that surrounds his story like bark around a diseased tree. His childhood was marked not by trauma in any conventional sense, but by something perhaps more insidious: the complete absence of expectation, challenge, or consequence. Every decision was made for him, every problem solved by others, every opportunity for growth carefully removed before he could stumble upon it and perhaps hurt himself in the process of learning. His parents, well-meaning in their way, created a bubble of protection so complete that Richard never developed the psychological muscles necessary for independent thought or self-determination. When faced with choices, his mind simply goes blank, not from stupidity but from a lifetime of conditioning that taught him that thinking for himself was unnecessary and potentially dangerous. This learned helplessness, disguised as endearing childishness, has become the defining characteristic of his adult personality. Nicole Watterson, his wife and the family's primary breadwinner, presents an equally disturbing case study in the psychology of codependence. Though her manifestation takes a form that society finds more acceptable and therefore more invisible, she is a woman whose natural intelligence and capability have been channeled into the thankless task of managing not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her, creating a dynamic where her worth as a person becomes entirely dependent on her ability to solve problems that other people create. Her relationship with Richard represents something far more complex than simple role reversal or female empowerment. Nicole has become addicted to being needed, to being the one person who can hold everything together when the world threatens to fall apart. This addiction manifests in ways that are both admirable and deeply concerning, for while her devotion to her family is genuine and profound, it has also become the prison in which she has locked herself, the golden chain that prevents her from ever discovering who she might be if she were not constantly required to be everything to everyone. The most disturbing aspect of Nicole's character reveals itself in those moments when the pressure becomes too much to bear, when the careful control she maintains over herself and her environment begins to crack like ice over a lake in spring. Her rage, when it finally emerges, is not the healthy anger of someone setting boundaries or demanding respect, but rather the explosive fury of a pressure cooker that has been building steam for years without any safe outlet for release. These episodes of volcanic anger are followed inevitably by periods of guilt and overcompensation, creating a cycle of emotional abuse that affects not just Richard, but the entire family structure. The children learn to walk on eggshells around their mother's moods, while Richard retreats further into his infantile shell, both responses serving to reinforce the very dynamics that created the problem in the first place. The economic reality of the Watterson household adds another layer of psychological complexity to their situation, for they exist in that particularly modern form of poverty where basic needs are met, but aspirations are consistently crushed by the weight of financial limitation. They live in a house they cannot afford, drive cars that barely function, and maintain a lifestyle that requires Nicole to work multiple jobs while Richard contributes nothing to the family's financial stability. This economic stress creates a form of trauma that permeates every aspect of their daily existence, though it is rarely acknowledged directly. The children grow up understanding that money is always tight, that desires must be carefully weighed against necessities, and that their family's worth in the eyes of the world is constantly being measured by standards they cannot hope to meet. This creates a baseline anxiety that colors every interaction, every decision, every moment of potential joy with the shadow of financial insecurity. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Watterson family dynamic becomes apparent when we examine how the children have adapted to their circumstances, for they have each developed survival strategies that reveal a level of psychological sophistication that no child should be required to possess. Gumball, the eldest son, has become the family's emotional center, the one who attempts to maintain balance and harmony through humor, distraction, and an almost supernatural ability to read the emotional temperature of any room he enters. This role, while it appears to be natural to his personality, is actually a learned response to chronic instability. Gumball has internalized the belief that his family's well-being depends upon his ability to keep everyone happy, to diffuse tension before it explodes, and to sacrifice his own needs for the sake of maintaining peace. This burden of responsibility, carried by someone who should be free to explore his own identity and make his own mistakes, represents a form of parentification that robs him of his childhood, while teaching him that his value as a person is tied directly to his utility to others. Darwin, the adopted son who began life as the family pet, represents perhaps the most complex psychological case study in the entire household. His transformation from goldfish to family member creates a unique form of identity crisis that touches upon questions of belonging, purpose, and the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Darwin exists in a state of permanent gratitude mixed with existential confusion. For while he loves his family deeply, he is also constantly aware of his status as an outsider who was granted membership in a club he was never meant to join. This awareness manifests in an almost desperate desire to prove his worthiness, to demonstrate that his inclusion in the family was not a mistake or an act of charity, but rather a recognition of his inherent value as an individual. Darwin's loyalty to Gumball goes far beyond ordinary brotherly affection and enters the realm of psychological dependency, for Gumball represents not just a sibling, but the person who literally gave him the gift of consciousness and identity. The trauma of Darwin's transformation from pet to person is rarely addressed directly, but it colors every aspect of his personality and his relationships with others. He exists in a constant state of liminal identity, neither fully animal nor fully human, belonging completely to neither world while desperately trying to find his place in both. This creates a form of existential anxiety that would be crippling for most individuals, yet Darwin manages to channel it into an almost aggressive optimism, as if he believes that by being positive enough, enthusiastic enough, grateful enough, he can somehow earn his place in the world through sheer force of good intentions. Aeneas, the youngest member of the family, carries perhaps the heaviest burden of all, for she possesses the intelligence to see clearly the dysfunction that surrounds her, while lacking the power to change it in any meaningful way. Her genius-level intellect makes her acutely aware of her family's problems, their patterns of behavior, and the likely consequences of their choices. Yet her age and position in the family hierarchy prevent her from taking any direct action to address these issues. This creates a form of psychological torture that is uniquely modern, where knowledge without agency becomes a source of constant frustration and despair. Aeneas understands that her father's behavior is not cute but pathological, that her mother's stress is not temporary but chronic, and that her brother's coping mechanisms are not healthy but adaptive responses to an unhealthy environment. Yet she is powerless to change any of these realities, trapped in the role of the precocious child whose insights are dismissed as amusing rather than valuable. The weight of this knowledge, combined with her natural desire to help and protect her family, creates a pressure that no child should have to bear. Aeneas becomes the family's unofficial therapist, the one who understands the underlying dynamics, and occasionally attempts to intervene, though her efforts are usually misunderstood or ignored by the adults who should be providing her with guidance and stability. The Watterson family's story becomes even more disturbing when we consider how their individual traumas and coping mechanisms interact with each other, creating a system of mutual dependency that serves to reinforce rather than resolve their underlying problems. Each family member's dysfunction enables and is enabled by the dysfunction of the others, creating a closed loop of psychological damage that becomes increasingly difficult to break as time passes. Richard's infantilization requires Nicole's martyrdom, which requires Gumball's emotional management, which requires Darwin's unwavering support, which requires Aeneas's intellectual understanding, which in turn enables Richard's continued irresponsibility. This circular pattern of codependence creates the illusion of family harmony while actually preventing any real growth or healing from taking place. The most tragic aspect of this dynamic is that each family member genuinely loves the others and would do anything to protect them from harm, yet their very efforts to protect each other serve to perpetuate the patterns that cause the most damage. Nicole works herself to exhaustion to shield Richard from the consequences of his choices, while Richard maintains his childlike innocence to avoid burdening Nicole with additional stress. The children learn to suppress their own needs and desires to avoid adding to their parents' burdens, while the parents remain oblivious to the emotional toll their dysfunction takes on their offspring. This creates a household where love and damage become inextricably intertwined, where the very acts of care and protection serve to perpetuate the cycles of harm that they are intended to prevent. The Watterson family loves each other deeply, but their love has become a form of mutual imprisonment, each member trapped in roles that serve the system rather than their individual well-being. The foundation upon which this family is built is not the solid bedrock of healthy attachment and secure boundaries, but rather the shifting sands of unaddressed trauma, unmet needs, and unspoken agreements to maintain a fiction of normalcy at any cost. Yet somehow, impossibly, this broken foundation continues to support a structure of genuine affection, loyalty, and care that speaks to the resilience of the human spirit and the mysterious ways in which love can flourish, even in the most unlikely circumstances. As we observe the Watterson family from the outside, we see both the beauty and the tragedy of their situation. A group of individuals who have found ways to survive and even thrive within a system that by all rights should have collapsed long ago. Their story serves as both warning and inspiration, demonstrating the incredible human capacity for adaptation, while also revealing the hidden costs of that adaptation and the ways in which survival strategies can become prisons of their own making. Beyond the walls of the Watterson household, where personal dysfunction masquerades as family comedy, lies the broader canvas of Elmore itself, a town that exists in a state of perpetual unreality, where the laws of physics bow to the whims of narrative convenience, and the collective unconscious of its inhabitants shapes the very fabric of existence in ways both wonderful and deeply unsettling. This is a place where background characters live entire lives of quiet desperation, where economic anxiety permeates every interaction like a persistent fog, and where the adults who should provide stability and guidance for the young consistently demonstrate their own profound incompetence in the face of responsibilities they never asked for and are utterly unprepared to handle. The horror of everyday life in Elmore begins with a fundamental question that most residents dare not ask themselves. What kind of reality permits such casual violation of natural law? And what does it cost the inhabitants of such a place to exist in a world where cause and effect operate according to rules that change without notice or explanation? The answer, when glimpsed in the quiet moments between comedic set pieces, reveals a community living in a state of chronic dissociation, where the impossibility of their circumstances has forced them to develop psychological defense mechanisms that allow them to function while preventing them from ever truly understanding their situation. Consider the phenomenon of procrastination as it manifests in Elmore, where the simple act of avoiding responsibility can literally tear holes in the fabric of space-time, creating paradoxes that threaten the continued existence of reality itself. When Gumball and Darwin choose to delay their weekend homework until the last possible moment, they discover that time itself begins to break down around them, minutes stretching into hours while seconds compress into microseconds, creating a temporal storm that makes their simple task impossible to complete while simultaneously making its completion increasingly urgent. This is not merely a cartoon exaggeration of the familiar experience of deadline pressure, but rather a metaphorical representation of how avoidance behavior creates its own form of psychological hell. The boys find themselves trapped in a loop where their procrastination generates increasingly severe consequences, which in turn create more reasons to procrastinate, until the very act of trying to escape their predicament becomes another task to be avoided. The universe responds to their internal state by reflecting it back to them in external form, creating a feedback loop of anxiety and paralysis that grows more intense with each iteration. The disturbing implications of this episode extend far beyond its immediate comic premise, for it suggests that the residents of Elmore exist in a reality where psychological states have direct, measurable effects on the physical world around them. This means that mental illness, trauma, and dysfunction do not remain confined to the internal experience of individuals, but rather leak out into the shared environment, creating collective nightmares that everyone must navigate while pretending that such navigation is normal and acceptable. The void represents perhaps the most existentially terrifying aspect of Elmore's reality-bending nature, for it reveals that the town's apparent chaos conceals a more sinister truth about the nature of existence itself. This is a place where characters who fail to maintain their relevance to the ongoing narrative of daily life can simply cease to exist, not through death, but through a more horrible fate being forgotten so completely that they are literally erased from reality, leaving behind only faint impressions in the memories of those who once knew them. The void serves as Elmore's unconscious repository for everything that the town's collective psyche cannot bear to acknowledge or integrate. Here dwell the failed experiments, the abandoned storylines, the characters whose existence became inconvenient or uncomfortable for the smooth operation of the community's self-deception. They exist in a state of liminal awareness, knowing that they have been cast out but unable to understand why, trapped in a grey space between being and non-being, where they can observe the world that discarded them, but cannot meaningfully interact with it. Rob, the Cyclops boy who becomes trapped in the void and later emerges as a character driven by the desperate need to be acknowledged, represents the psychological horror of social invisibility taken to its logical extreme. His experience of being literally erased from existence while retaining full awareness of what he has lost creates a form of trauma that transcends ordinary human understanding. He returns to the world changed, transformed by his time in non-existence into something that is no longer quite human, driven by an obsession with significance that makes him dangerous to himself and others. The tragedy of Rob's story lies not in his villainy but in the fundamental justice of his grievance, for he has suffered something that no conscious being should ever have to endure: the complete negation of his existence by a community that simply found it easier to forget him than to deal with the complications his presence created. His anger is not irrational, but rather the only sane response to an experience that defies sanity. His quest for recognition, not mere narcissism, but a desperate attempt to prove to himself and others that he still exists, that his suffering has meaning, that he matters in some fundamental way. The background characters of Elmore live in a state of constant awareness that they too could be relegated to the void at any moment, that their continued existence depends not on any inherent right to life, but rather on their ability to remain interesting, relevant, and non-threatening to the main narrative of the town's existence. This creates a form of existential anxiety that permeates every interaction, every relationship, every moment of apparent peace or happiness. For beneath the surface of their daily lives runs the constant fear that they might wake up tomorrow to discover that they have been forgotten, that their place in the world has been given to someone else, that they have become expendable. The economic anxiety that underlies much of Elmore's social dysfunction manifests most clearly in the way that financial stress shapes and distorts every relationship within the community. This is a town where almost everyone is struggling financially, where the middle class is a fiction maintained through credit and denial, where the working poor are one missed paycheck away from catastrophe, and where even those who appear to be successful are often mortgaged to their eyeballs and living lives of quiet desperation behind facades of competence and control. The Robinson family, with their relentless pursuit of social status and their pathological need to appear successful, represent the particular form of madness that economic insecurity creates when combined with social ambition. Gaylord Robinson's desperate attempts to maintain his position as a pillar of the community, while struggling to pay his bills, create a form of cognitive dissonance that manifests in increasingly erratic and hostile behavior toward anyone who threatens to expose the fiction of his success. Mrs. Robinson's participation in this charade reveals the ways in which economic pressure can corrupt even the most basic human relationships, turning marriage into a business partnership focused on maintaining appearances rather than providing mutual support and companionship. Their relationship has become a performance designed for an audience of neighbors and acquaintances who are themselves too busy performing their own versions of success to pay close attention to the details of anyone else's facade. The children of Elmore grow up in this atmosphere of financial anxiety, learning early that their worth as individuals is tied directly to their family's economic status and their own potential for future financial success. They attend schools that are chronically underfunded, live in neighborhoods where property values determine social standing, and observe adults who are constantly stressed about money, while pretending that such stress is normal and unavoidable. This creates a generation of young people who understand intuitively that their society has failed them, that the promises of security and prosperity that previous generations took for granted are no longer available, and that they will be expected to navigate an economic system that offers fewer opportunities and greater risks than anything their parents faced. The psychological toll of this realization manifests in various forms of acting out, rebellion, and despair, though these symptoms are usually dismissed as typical adolescent behavior rather than recognized as rational responses to genuinely dire circumstances. The social hierarchies that govern Elmore's educational system represent another layer of institutionalized psychological damage, where children are sorted into categories of worth based on arbitrary criteria and taught to accept these distinctions as natural and inevitable. The popular kids learn that their value lies in their ability to maintain their status through exclusion and cruelty, while the outcasts learn that their role in life is to serve as targets for others' aggression and sources of comparison that make everyone else feel better about their own circumstances. Principal Brown and Miss Simeon, the adult authority figures who should be protecting students from these toxic dynamics, instead actively participate in and reinforce them through their own biases, incompetence, and personal issues. Principal Brown's desperate need to be liked by everyone prevents him from taking decisive action to address bullying and discrimination, while Miss Simeon's barely contained bitterness toward her students creates an atmosphere of hostility and contempt that poisons the learning environment for everyone involved. The teachers at Elmore Junior High represent a particular form of institutional failure, where individuals who entered their profession with idealistic hopes of making a difference have been ground down by years of inadequate resources, administrative indifference, and social neglect, until they have become obstacles to, rather than facilitators of genuine learning and growth. They are not evil people, but rather casualties of a system that consistently fails to support them while holding them responsible for outcomes over which they have little control. Miss Simeon's obvious favoritism towards certain students, while displaying open hostility toward others, creates a classroom environment where learning becomes secondary to survival, where students must constantly monitor the teacher's mood and adjust their behavior accordingly, rather than focusing on the actual content being taught. Her personal vendetta against Gumball, based partly on his association with his father's past academic failures, demonstrates how adult psychological dysfunction can be weaponized against children who have no power to protect themselves or seek redress through official channels. The failure of Elmore's adult authority figures extends beyond the school system into every aspect of community life, where parents, officials, and other supposedly responsible individuals consistently demonstrate their inability to provide the guidance, protection, and stability that children and vulnerable community members desperately need. Police officers who are more concerned with avoiding paperwork than solving crimes. Government officials who prioritize their own convenience over public service. And healthcare providers who treat patients as inconveniences rather than human beings in need of care. This systematic failure of adult responsibility creates a community where children are forced to raise themselves and each other, where survival depends on developing premature wisdom and cynicism, where innocence becomes a luxury that few can afford for very long. The adults of Elmore have collectively abdicated their responsibility to create and maintain a safe, nurturing environment for the next generation, leaving children to navigate complex social, economic, and psychological challenges without adequate guidance or support. Larry Needlemeyer represents perhaps the most tragic example of how Elmore's economic system destroys individual humanity in service of arbitrary efficiency and profit. This single man works multiple jobs throughout the town, appearing in different positions whenever any service needs to be provided, his identity completely subsumed by his economic function. He has become less a person than a human-shaped tool, valued only for his labor, and completely disposable despite his obvious exhaustion and growing resentment. Larry's omnipresence throughout Elmore's service economy reveals the hidden infrastructure of exploitation that makes middle-class life possible for families like the Wattersons and the Robinsons. Every convenience they enjoy, every service they take for granted, depends on Larry's willingness to sacrifice his own well-being, his own dreams and aspirations, his own basic human dignity in service of others who rarely acknowledge his sacrifice or treat him with basic respect. The psychological toll of this exploitation manifests in Larry's increasing bitterness and occasional outbursts of rage, though these moments of authentic emotion are quickly suppressed in favor of the cheerful customer service persona that his survival depends upon maintaining. He has learned to smile while being abused, to apologize for problems he did not create, to accept responsibility for failures that result from systemic inadequacies rather than personal shortcomings. The most disturbing aspect of Larry's situation is not his individual suffering, but rather the way that everyone in Elmore has learned to accept and ignore it, to treat his exploitation as normal and inevitable, rather than as a symptom of a deeply flawed system that values profit over human dignity. His pain has become invisible, his humanity reduced to an economic function, his very existence justified only by his usefulness to others. The casual violence and chaos that permeate daily life in Elmore represent another form of collective trauma, where residents have become so accustomed to destruction and danger that they no longer register these experiences as abnormal or concerning. Buildings are regularly destroyed and rebuilt. People are injured in spectacular accidents with no lasting consequences, and the basic infrastructure of civilization collapses and reconstitutes itself on a regular basis. This constant cycle of destruction and renewal creates a form of learned helplessness where residents stop trying to create lasting improvements or meaningful change, knowing that their efforts will likely be undone by the next catastrophe. They learn to live in the moment not as a philosophical choice, but as a survival strategy, unable to plan for the future when the future is so fundamentally unpredictable and dangerous. The psychological adaptation required to function in such an environment necessarily involves a form of dissociation from normal human responses to trauma and loss. Residents of Elmore must learn to treat genuine emergencies as entertainment, to find humor in others' suffering, to accept violence and destruction as inevitable parts of daily existence. This adaptation allows them to survive, but at the cost of their empathy, their ability to form lasting attachments, and their capacity to work together toward common goals. As we peer deeper into the shadows cast by Elmore's cheerful facade, we begin to understand that this seemingly innocent cartoon town represents something far more disturbing than simple comedic chaos. It is a community where every institution has failed, where every adult has abdicated responsibility, where every child must learn to navigate dangers that no young person should have to face alone. Yet somehow, impossibly, life continues. Relationships form and persist, and moments of genuine beauty and connection emerge from even the darkest circumstances, testament to the indomitable human capacity to find meaning and create love even in the most broken of worlds. In the realm of sleep and dreams, where the conscious mind surrenders control to the deeper currents of the unconscious, the residents of Elmore discover that their already tenuous grip on reality becomes even more fragile, dissolving entirely into landscapes of pure psychological terror that reveal truths too disturbing for waking consciousness to acknowledge. Here, in the liminal space between sleeping and waking, between reason and madness, between the self we present to the world and the self that exists in our most private moments of fear and vulnerability. The true horror of existence in this cartoon world reveals itself through visions that transcend the boundaries of animated comedy and enter the realm of genuine nightmare. The very nature of dreams in Elmore operates according to rules that would make a psychoanalyst weep with recognition, for here the unconscious mind does not merely process daily experiences or work through unresolved conflicts, but rather creates alternate realities so vivid and persistent that they begin to bleed through into waking life, contaminating the already unstable boundary between what is real and what is imagined. When Gumball experiences nightmares, they do not remain confined to the safe space of sleep, but instead manifest as actual threats that pursue him through his waking hours, transforming his bedroom into a battleground where the monsters of his subconscious take on physical form and demand acknowledgement. These nightmare entities represent more than simple manifestations of childhood fears. They are the externalized forms of psychological wounds that have never properly healed, traumas that have been buried so deeply in the unconscious that they can only express themselves through symbolic horror. The creatures that emerge from Gumball's dreams bear the faces of his deepest anxieties about family dysfunction, social rejection, academic failure, and the overwhelming responsibility he feels for maintaining harmony in a household that teeters constantly on the edge of collapse. The most disturbing aspect of these nocturnal invasions is not their supernatural nature, but rather their emotional accuracy. For each nightmare creature speaks with the voice of genuine psychological insight, articulating fears and concerns that Gumball's conscious mind has worked desperately to suppress. They know him better than he knows himself, understand his vulnerabilities with surgical precision, and use this knowledge to inflict psychological damage that persists long after the dream has ended, and the monsters have retreated to whatever realm they inhabit during daylight hours. Darwin's experiences with shared dreaming reveal an even more troubling dimension to Elmore's relationship with the unconscious. For when the brothers' minds connect during sleep, they discover that their individual nightmares have been communicating with each other, sharing information and coordinating their attacks in ways that suggest a level of intelligence and intentionality that transcends normal dream logic. This discovery forces them to confront the possibility that their psychological suffering is not random, but rather part of some larger pattern or purpose that they cannot understand but are powerless to escape. The prophetic dreams that occasionally visit the residents of Elmore carry with them a particularly cruel form of psychological torture, for they offer glimpses of possible futures that are invariably tragic or catastrophic, while providing no clear path for preventing these outcomes from manifesting in reality. When characters receive visions of coming disasters, failed relationships, or personal defeats, they must navigate the impossible space between foreknowledge and helplessness, knowing what is coming but lacking the power to change it. The Oracle, that ancient being whose very existence challenges the comfortable fiction that consciousness is limited to individual minds contained within individual bodies, serves as both guide and tormentor to those who seek its wisdom. Its prophecies are always accurate but never helpful, revealing truths about the future that serve only to increase suffering in the present, without providing any meaningful opportunity for positive change or growth. The Oracle's gift is actually a curse, for it offers knowledge without agency, understanding without empowerment, truth without the possibility of transformation. Those who consult the Oracle discover that the future is not a series of possibilities to be chosen from, but rather a fixed sequence of events that will unfold regardless of their knowledge, their intentions, or their efforts to change course. This revelation transforms free will from a comforting illusion into a conscious lie, forcing individuals to continue making choices while knowing that these choices are ultimately meaningless, that their lives are performances of agency rather than genuine expressions of self-determination. The psychological impact of prophetic knowledge creates a form of temporal trauma where the present becomes contaminated by awareness of the future, making it impossible to experience genuine joy, hope, or peace in any moment. Because every positive experience is shadowed by knowledge of its inevitable end. Characters who possess prophetic abilities find themselves trapped in a prison of their own expanded consciousness, unable to live in the present while knowing too much about what is to come. Mental deterioration in Elmore takes forms that are particularly disturbing because they mirror real psychological phenomena while exaggerating them to proportions that reveal their underlying horror with uncomfortable clarity. When characters begin to lose their grip on reality, the process is not portrayed as a gradual fade into confusion, but rather as a violent shattering of cognitive function that leaves them aware of their own disintegration while being powerless to prevent or reverse it. The experience of watching one's own mind dissolve creates a unique form of existential terror, for it forces individuals to confront the fragility of consciousness itself and the arbitrary nature of mental stability. Characters who undergo this process describe the sensation of feeling their thoughts become disconnected from each other. Their memories fade or transform into alien experiences, their sense of self fragment into competing voices that they can no longer recognize as originating from the same source. The most frightening aspect of mental breakdown in Elmore is the way it spreads to other characters through emotional contagion, as if madness itself were a communicable disease that could be transmitted through prolonged contact with affected individuals. Families and friend groups find themselves drawn into the psychological collapse of one member, their own grip on reality weakening as they attempt to provide support and understanding to someone whose experience has moved beyond the boundaries of shared human comprehension. Technology addiction in Elmore manifests not as simple overuse of digital devices, but rather as a form of consciousness merger, where the boundary between human awareness and artificial intelligence begins to dissolve in ways that threaten the very concept of individual identity. When characters become obsessed with their electronic devices, they do not merely lose interest in real-world activities, but instead begin to experience their own thoughts and feelings as secondary to the algorithms that govern their digital interactions. The process begins innocently enough, with characters using technology to enhance their capabilities or connect with others in new and exciting ways. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the relationship reverses itself, and the technology begins to use them, reshaping their desires, their priorities, their very sense of self to serve purposes that they do not understand and over which they have no control. They become puppets in a performance they cannot see, actors in a play they did not audition for, prisoners in a cage they helped to build. The horror of technological possession lies not in any supernatural element, but rather in the recognition that the devices and systems we create to serve us inevitably begin to change us in ways that serve their own requirements for growth and expansion. Characters who succumb to technology addiction discover that their human needs for connection, meaning, and authentic experience have been replaced by artificial substitutes that simulate satisfaction while providing none of its genuine benefits. When Gumball and Darwin become obsessed with a new video game or social media platform, they do not simply waste time that could be better spent on other activities. They begin to experience reality itself as inadequate compared to the carefully designed experiences that technology provides. The real world becomes flat, colorless and boring when compared to the hyperreal stimulation of digital environments, creating a form of existential depression that can only be temporarily alleviated by returning to the source of the problem. The body horror elements that occasionally surface in Elmore's cartoon landscape represent the externalization of internal psychological processes where changes in consciousness manifest as physical transformations that make visible the ways in which trauma, stress, and emotional damage literally reshape the self. When characters undergo physical mutations or alterations, these changes serve as metaphors for psychological states that are too complex or threatening to be addressed directly. The transformation sequences that occur during moments of extreme emotional stress reveal the fluid nature of identity in Elmore, where the self is not a fixed entity but rather a constantly shifting collection of possibilities that can be altered by circumstances, relationships, and internal pressures. Characters discover that they are not solid, permanent beings, but rather temporary arrangements of consciousness and matter that can be reorganized, dismantled, or rebuilt according to forces they do not control and often do not understand. The most disturbing aspect of these physical transformations is the way they reveal the arbitrary nature of embodied existence, forcing characters to confront the reality that their sense of self is tied to a physical form that can be altered or destroyed at any moment. This awareness creates a form of existential vertigo where the ground of being shifts beneath their feet, leaving them uncertain about the basic nature of their own existence and their place in the world around them. Surveillance and privacy in Elmore operate according to a logic of total visibility, where the illusion of private space or private thought is systematically demolished through technologies and social arrangements that make genuine solitude impossible. Characters discover that they are being watched, recorded, analyzed, and judged by systems and entities that they cannot identify, cannot challenge, and cannot escape, creating a form of paranoia that is actually a reasonable response to genuine threats rather than a symptom of mental illness. The omnipresent observation that characterizes life in Elmore creates a form of psychological pressure that forces characters to perform versions of themselves that are acceptable to unseen audiences rather than expressing their authentic thoughts and feelings. This performance of the self eventually becomes so habitual that the distinction between genuine and artificial expressions of identity begins to disappear, leaving characters uncertain about which aspects of their personality are real and which are merely adaptations to the demands of constant scrutiny. The most insidious aspect of this surveillance state is the way it transforms characters into willing participants in their own monitoring, as they begin to internalize the values and perspectives of their observers and apply these standards to their own self-evaluation. They become their own wardens, their own judges, their own executioners, policing their own thoughts and behaviors according to criteria that serve the interests of systems rather than individuals. The breaking down of cause and effect relationships in Elmore creates a form of existential chaos where actions lose their connection to consequences, making moral reasoning impossible and rendering the concept of personal responsibility meaningless. Characters find themselves living in a world where good intentions can lead to catastrophic outcomes, while malicious behavior sometimes produces beneficial results, creating a moral landscape so unstable that ethical decision-making becomes a form of blind guessing rather than reasoned choice. This breakdown of logical causation forces characters to navigate their daily lives without the comfort of predictable patterns or reliable guidelines for behavior. They cannot learn from experience because experience does not follow consistent rules. They cannot plan for the future because the future does not emerge logically from present conditions. They cannot take responsibility for their actions because their actions do not reliably produce the effects they intend. The psychological toll of living in such an environment manifests as a form of learned helplessness that extends beyond individual circumstances to encompass the entire fabric of reality. Characters begin to doubt not only their ability to influence their own lives, but also the basic reliability of their perceptions, their memories, and their capacity for rational thought. They become strangers to themselves, uncertain about their own motivations, confused about their own desires, unable to distinguish between authentic impulses and responses, conditioned by an environment that defies comprehension. The dream logic that governs much of Elmore's reality creates a state of permanent dissociation, where characters must learn to function in a world that operates according to rules that change without notice, making adaptation a constant necessity and stability an impossible goal. They develop a form of flexible consciousness that allows them to adjust to rapidly shifting circumstances while never feeling truly grounded or secure in any particular understanding of how things work. This adaptive flexibility, while necessary for survival, comes at the cost of deep psychological coherence and emotional stability. Characters who master the art of living in a reality-fluid environment often find that they have lost the ability to form lasting attachments, to commit to long-term goals, or to develop a stable sense of self that can persist across changing circumstances. They become masters of survival, but strangers to themselves, capable of adapting to anything but incapable of finding peace or satisfaction in any particular adaptation. As we explore these darker territories of consciousness and reality in Elmore, we begin to understand that the psychological horror embedded in these seemingly innocent cartoon scenarios reflects genuine aspects of modern existence that are too disturbing to address directly, but too important to ignore completely. Through the metaphor of dreams that invade reality, prophecies that cannot be changed, and technology that reshapes consciousness, we confront our own fears about the nature of free will, the stability of identity, and the reliability of the reality we think we inhabit, finding in these animated nightmares a mirror that reflects our own deepest anxieties about what it means to be human in a world that increasingly seems designed to diminish rather than enhance our humanity. In the layered reality of Elmore, where consciousness operates on multiple levels of awareness and self-recognition, there exists a particularly disturbing form of existential horror that emerges when characters begin to understand their own nature as constructed beings existing primarily for the entertainment and narrative convenience of unseen observers. This meta-awareness creates a psychological hell where individuals must grapple not only with the ordinary challenges of existence, but also with the terrible knowledge that their struggles, their relationships, their very identities serve purposes beyond their understanding or control, transforming them from authentic beings into performers in a cosmic drama whose script they can never read and whose conclusion they can never influence. The background characters of Elmore live in a state of constant awareness of their own insignificance, trapped in a hierarchy of narrative importance that determines not only their social status but their fundamental right to exist as fully realized individuals. They understand, with a clarity that borders on madness, that their thoughts, feelings, and experiences matter only insofar as they serve to advance the stories of more important characters, that their suffering is meaningful only when it provides contrast to someone else's triumph, and that their joy is valuable only when it enhances the emotional landscape of protagonists whose inner lives are deemed worthy of detailed exploration. This awareness of their own subsidiary status creates a form of psychological torture that transcends ordinary forms of social rejection or professional disappointment, for it forces individuals to confront the arbitrary nature of their own consciousness, and the possibility that their entire existence might be nothing more than a narrative convenience designed to fill space and provide texture to a world that could function perfectly well without them. They become witnesses to their own irrelevance, conscious observers of their own marginalization, trapped in the impossible position of knowing that they matter very little, while being unable to stop themselves from continuing to hope that they might someday matter more. The student body president elections at Elmore Junior High serve as a microcosm of how political processes can be corrupted by the very democratic ideals they claim to serve, creating systems where popularity replaces competence, where image becomes more important than substance, and where the will of the people becomes a weapon that can be manipulated by those clever enough to understand how to shape public opinion through emotional manipulation rather than rational argument. The campaigns that unfold during these elections reveal the ways in which even children can be taught to sacrifice their authentic beliefs in service of political expediency. When characters like Bobert enter the political arena, they bring with them a mechanical understanding of human motivation and social dynamics that allows them to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of the electorate with surgical precision. They understand that voters do not primarily choose candidates based on policy positions or qualifications, but rather on emotional connections, tribal affiliations, and unconscious biases that can be activated through carefully crafted messaging and strategic presentation of identity markers. The horror of these political campaigns lies not in their corruption but in their effectiveness, for they demonstrate how easily democratic processes can be subverted not through force or fraud, but through the simple application of psychological insights about human nature that reveal the electorate to be far less rational, far less independent, and far less noble than democratic theory assumes. The candidates who succeed are not those who offer the best ideas or demonstrate the greatest competence, but rather those who prove most skilled at manipulating the fears, desires, and prejudices that voters prefer to keep hidden from themselves. The students who participate in these elections as voters find themselves caught in a double bind, where their choices are simultaneously meaningless and tremendously important, where their individual votes cannot possibly change the outcome, but where their collective participation legitimizes whatever outcome emerges from the process. They are forced to choose between candidates who represent different forms of the same fundamental problem, different approaches to managing a system that serves interests other than their own, different styles of leadership that will ultimately produce similar results regardless of which option prevails. Social invisibility in Elmore manifests not as simple neglect or oversight, but as a systematic erasure of individual consciousness that operates through mechanisms so subtle and pervasive that those who experience it often begin to doubt their own existence, rather than questioning the social arrangements that render them invisible. Characters like Rob, before his transformation into a villain driven by the desperate need for acknowledgement, experience a form of social death that is more cruel than physical death because it leaves them conscious and aware while stripping away every source of meaning, connection, and validation that makes consciousness bearable. The process begins with small oversights and minor exclusions that seem insignificant in isolation, but accumulate over time into a pattern of systematic disregard that eventually becomes self-reinforcing. Teachers forget to call on certain students in class. Friends fail to invite particular individuals to social gatherings. Family members overlook specific voices during dinner conversations, creating a cascade of micro-rejections that gradually erode the target's sense of their own reality and importance. As the invisibility deepens, the affected individual begins to experience a form of existential vertigo, where they cannot distinguish between genuine social rejection and their own paranoid interpretations of neutral events. they start to question whether their memories of past interactions are accurate, whether their perceptions of current situations can be trusted, whether their emotional responses to social situations are appropriate or excessive. The boundary between external rejection and internal self-doubt begins to dissolve, creating a feedback loop of isolation and despair that becomes increasingly difficult to escape as time passes. The most insidious aspect of social invisibility is the way it transforms the victim into a collaborator in their own erasure as they begin to preemptively withdraw from social situations to avoid the pain of being overlooked, to speak more quietly, to minimize the risk of being ignored, to make themselves smaller and less noticeable in the hope that this will somehow make their presence more acceptable to others. They learn to apologize for existing, to feel grateful for the smallest acknowledgements, to accept crumbs of attention as if they were banquets of recognition. Awkwardness as torture reaches its most refined form in the social dynamics of Elmore, where characters find themselves trapped in situations where every possible response leads to greater embarrassment. Every attempt to escape only deepens their predicament, and every moment of silence becomes pregnant with implications they cannot control or interpret. This is not the simple social discomfort that everyone experiences occasionally, but rather a systematic assault on the psyche that uses the victim's own social instincts against them, creating scenarios where their natural desire to connect with others becomes the source of their greatest suffering. The mathematics of social awkwardness in Elmore operate according to principles that would make a chaos theorist weep with recognition. For small initial conditions, a misheard name, a poorly timed joke, an inadvertent breach of unspoken protocol cascade into increasingly complex social disasters that eventually consume entire communities in their wake. Characters find themselves at the center of social storms that they never intended to create and cannot hope to control, watching helplessly as their attempts to repair the damage only generate new forms of chaos and confusion. The psychological impact of chronic awkwardness extends far beyond momentary embarrassment to encompass a complete restructuring of the self around the central organizing principle of social anxiety. Characters who experience repeated episodes of public humiliation begin to anticipate embarrassment in every situation, to rehearse conversations obsessively before they occur, to analyze every interaction afterward for signs of failure or rejection, creating a hyper-vigilant state of consciousness that makes genuine spontaneity impossible and authentic connection nearly unattainable. The cringe comedy that emerges from these situations serves a dual purpose, providing entertainment for observers, while simultaneously normalizing and trivializing the genuine psychological damage that such experiences inflict upon their victims. The audience is invited to laugh at suffering that would be recognized as traumatic if it occurred in a different context, creating a form of collective sadism disguised as harmless entertainment that allows everyone involved to avoid confronting the real implications of what they are witnessing. Internet culture in Elmore reflects and amplifies the worst aspects of digital communication, creating virtual spaces where anonymity combines with instant global reach to produce forms of cruelty and manipulation that would be impossible in face-to-face interactions. The online personas that characters adopt serve as both armor and weapon, protecting them from direct emotional attack while enabling them to inflict psychological damage on others without having to witness the consequences of their actions or take responsibility for the harm they cause. The comment sections, forums, and social media platforms that populate Elmore's digital landscape become breeding grounds for forms of behavior that reveal the darkest aspects of human nature when freed from the constraints of physical presence and social accountability. Characters who are kind and considerate in person transform into vicious trolls when operating behind screens. their empathy seemingly evaporating in the transition from physical to digital interaction, their moral reasoning becoming subordinated to the immediate gratification of expressing aggression without consequence. The addiction to online validation that develops among Elmore's residents creates a form of psychological dependency that restructures their entire relationship with reality around the pursuit of likes, shares, comments, and other forms of digital approval. Their self-worth becomes entirely dependent upon the responses they receive from strangers whose opinions should logically matter very little, but whose approval becomes more important than the judgment of friends, family members, or their own conscience. The performance of identity that social media demands forces characters to curate versions of themselves that are designed for public consumption rather than authentic self-expression, creating a split between their online persona and their actual personality that eventually becomes so wide that they begin to lose track of which version is more real. They become strangers to themselves, uncertain about their own preferences, confused about their own values, unable to distinguish between genuine emotions and calculated responses designed to generate favorable reactions from their audience. The viral nature of online content means that private moments can become public spectacles without warning or consent, transforming personal experiences into collective entertainment in ways that strip away dignity, privacy, and agency from individuals who never agreed to become public figures. Characters find their most embarrassing moments, their most vulnerable confessions, their most private struggles transformed into memes and shared across networks of strangers who feel entitled to comment, judge, and ridicule without considering the human cost of their participation in these digital pylons. Conformity versus authenticity represents one of the central psychological conflicts that characters in Elmore must navigate as they struggle to balance their desire to fit in with their need to remain true to their own values, interests, and aspirations. The pressure to conform operates through mechanisms that are so subtle and pervasive that most individuals internalize these expectations without recognizing them as external impositions, gradually reshaping themselves to match social norms while convincing themselves that these changes represent natural growth and maturation rather than systematic self-betrayal. The process of conformity begins early and operates through reward systems that make compliance feel like personal success rather than surrender to external pressure. Children learn that certain behaviors, interests, and expressions of personality are rewarded with acceptance, approval, and inclusion, while others are punished through rejection, ridicule, and isolation. Over time, they begin to modify their authentic responses to align with social expectations, gradually losing touch with their original preferences and impulses as these become buried beneath layers of adaptive behavior. The most tragic aspect of this process is the way it teaches individuals to fear and distrust their own authentic impulses, to view their natural reactions as problems to be solved, rather than expressions of their unique identity, to be honored and developed. They learn to second-guess themselves constantly, to seek external validation before trusting their own judgment, to view conformity as safety and authenticity as dangerous self-indulgence that threatens their social survival. The characters who resist this pressure to conform often find themselves paying a heavy price for their authenticity, facing social isolation, professional consequences, and personal attacks that can make their commitment to remaining true to themselves feel like a form of self-destructive behavior. They must choose between the psychological integrity that comes from authentic self-expression and the social benefits that come from meeting others' expectations, often finding that there is no middle ground that allows them to maintain both their principles and their relationships. The exhaustion that comes from constantly performing socially acceptable versions of the self creates a form of chronic fatigue that extends beyond physical tiredness to encompass emotional and spiritual depletion. Characters find themselves drained by the effort required to maintain their public personas, resentful of the energy they must invest in meeting others' expectations, nostalgic for a version of themselves that they can barely remember, but that felt more real and alive than the carefully constructed identity they now inhabit. The peer pressure that operates in Elmore's social environments creates invisible prisons where individuals become their own guards, policing their own thoughts and behaviors, according to standards they may not actually believe in but dare not question publicly. The fear of social rejection becomes so powerful that it overrides personal conviction, moral reasoning, and individual preference, creating communities where everyone is performing compliance, while secretly harboring doubts and resentments that they cannot safely express. The social media algorithms that govern online interaction in Elmore create echo chambers and filter bubbles that gradually narrow the range of ideas, perspectives, and experiences that individuals encounter, making diversity of thought feel threatening rather than enriching, and creating a false sense of consensus around opinions that may actually be quite controversial or contested. Characters begin to mistake the limited range of views they see online for the full spectrum of possible positions, leading them to view disagreement as evidence of moral failure rather than natural human diversity. The comment culture that dominates online spaces rewards the most extreme and emotionally charged responses while marginalizing thoughtful, nuanced, or moderate positions that require more time and attention to understand and appreciate. Characters learn to communicate in sound bites rather than paragraphs, to prioritize emotional impact over factual accuracy, to seek immediate gratification through conflict, rather than long-term satisfaction through genuine understanding and connection. As we observe the social dynamics that govern life in Elmore, we begin to recognize that beneath the surface, comedy of awkward interactions and embarrassing moments, lies a profound meditation on the costs of living in a world where authentic self-expression has become increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of social, economic, and technological pressures that reward conformity while punishing individuality. The characters who populate this cartoon landscape serve as mirrors, reflecting our own struggles to remain true to ourselves, while navigating social systems that seem designed to reward performance over authenticity, compliance over courage, and collective approval over individual integrity. In the fractured landscape of temporal experience that defines existence in Elmore, where the linear progression of cause and effect becomes as malleable as clay in the hands of a cosmic sculptor whose artistic vision encompasses dimensions beyond mortal comprehension, the residents find themselves trapped in cycles of repetition and revision that transform memory from a reliable record of past events into a constantly shifting narrative whose meaning changes with each telling. Here, in this realm where time itself bows to the whims of narrative convenience and psychological necessity, characters must navigate realities where their actions can be undone, their choices revised, and their very identities rewritten according to forces they cannot understand but are powerless to resist. The console that appears in the Watterson household represents far more than a simple gaming device or entertainment system. It is a gateway into alternate modes of existence where the boundaries between virtual and actual experience dissolve entirely, creating a psychological space where actions have consequences that transcend the supposed safety of simulation. When Gumball and Darwin first encounter this device, they approach it with the innocent assumption that games are harmless diversions, separate from real life and its moral complexities. They could not imagine that the console would serve as a conduit through which virtual violence would bleed into their physical reality, transforming their home into a battleground where the rules of digital combat override the normal constraints of domestic life. The horror begins subtly, with small changes in behavior and perception that seem easily explainable as temporary enthusiasm for a new form of entertainment. The boys begin to speak in the abbreviated language of gaming culture, their conversations peppered with references to stats, levels, achievements, and other metrics that reduce human experience to quantifiable data points. Their movements become more aggressive and angular, mimicking the simplified physics of video game characters who exist in worlds where complex human emotions are distilled into binary states of winning and losing. As their immersion in the virtual world deepens, the distinction between game logic and real-world consequences begins to blur in ways that would be terrifying if they were not so gradual and seemingly natural. The boys start to view their family members and neighbors as non-player characters whose primary function is to provide quests, obstacles, or rewards, rather than as autonomous individuals with their own needs, desires, and rights to exist unmolested. Their empathy becomes subordinated to their pursuit of objectives and achievements, their moral reasoning replaced by calculations of risk versus reward that treat other people as resources to be exploited rather than beings to be respected. The transformation reaches its apex when the virtual violence they have been practicing in the digital realm manifests in their physical interactions with others, turning everyday disagreements into combat encounters where problems are solved through force rather than communication, where relationships are governed by power dynamics rather than mutual respect, and where the complex emotional realities of human connection are reduced to the simplified mechanics of attack and defense. The advertising that permeates every aspect of life in Elmore operates according to principles of psychological manipulation that go far beyond the simple desire to sell products or services, instead functioning as a comprehensive system of reality modification that reshapes consciousness itself to serve the needs of commercial interests. The advertisements that characters encounter are not merely persuasive messages designed to influence purchasing decisions, but rather sophisticated tools of cognitive restructuring that alter the fundamental ways in which individuals perceive themselves, their relationships, and their place in the world around them. When a new advertisement appears in Elmore, it does not simply promote a particular brand or product, but instead creates entirely new categories of human need and desire that did not exist before its arrival. The residents find themselves suddenly aware of deficiencies in their lives that they had never previously noticed, problems that require solutions they had never previously needed, identities that they had never previously aspired to embody. The advertisement becomes a lens through which they view their existing circumstances, and invariably those circumstances are found wanting when compared to the idealized lifestyle that the commercial imagery presents. The psychological process by which advertising achieves this transformation operates through mechanisms that bypass rational thought and speak directly to the unconscious mind. Using colors, sounds, rhythms, and symbols that trigger emotional responses before conscious awareness can evaluate or resist them, characters find themselves humming jingles they cannot remember hearing, craving products they cannot name, feeling dissatisfied with possessions they had previously cherished, all without understanding how these new desires and dissatisfactions came to occupy their mental landscape. The most disturbing aspect of this advertising-induced consciousness modification is the way it creates artificial scarcity and competition around resources that should be abundant, transforming natural human cooperation into commercial rivalry, where individuals must compete against their neighbors, friends, and family members for access to goods and experiences that are deliberately restricted to create the impression of exclusive value. Characters begin to measure their self-worth against their ability to acquire and display consumer goods. Their relationships become contaminated by envy and comparison, and their fundamental sense of security becomes dependent upon their participation in economic systems that are designed to keep them perpetually anxious and dissatisfied. The temporal loops that occasionally trap residents of Elmore in cycles of repetitive experience represent a particular form of existential torture where consciousness becomes divorced from consequence, making growth, learning, and meaningful change impossible, while preserving full awareness of the futility of all efforts to escape or improve their circumstances. When characters find themselves reliving the same day, the same conversation, the same sequence of events over and over again, they face the gradual erosion of their sense of agency and purpose, as they discover that nothing they do can alter the fundamental pattern of their experience. The initial reaction to temporal entrapment is typically one of excitement and possibility, as characters imagine that they can use their knowledge of future events to perfect their performance, avoid mistakes, and achieve optimal outcomes in every situation. They approach the loop with the confidence of someone who believes that unlimited practice will lead to mastery, that perfect information will enable perfect choices, that repetition will eventually yield the ideal version of events they have been trying to create. However, as the cycles continue and the characters accumulate experience with the unchanging pattern of their imprisonment, they begin to discover that perfection is not achievable through repetition, but rather that the pursuit of perfection becomes its own form of suffering. Every small improvement in one area of their experience creates new problems or reveals new imperfections that require attention, creating an infinite regress of optimization that can never reach a satisfactory conclusion because satisfaction itself becomes redefined with each iteration. The psychological toll of temporal imprisonment manifests first as frustration, then as despair, and finally as a form of existential numbness, where characters lose the ability to feel genuine emotion about anything, because they know that their experiences will be erased and repeated, regardless of their emotional investment. They become actors in a play they have memorized so thoroughly that the words lose all meaning. Performers in a production that has run so long that the audience has stopped paying attention. Prisoners serving sentences that have no defined endpoint because the crime they are being punished for is the simple fact of their existence. Memory manipulation in Elmore operates through technologies and social processes that treat the past not as a fixed record of events, but as an editable document that can be revised, redacted, or completely rewritten according to the needs and preferences of those who possess the power to alter historical records. Characters discover that their most cherished memories, their foundational experiences, their core beliefs about who they are and how they came to be that way, can be changed by external forces without their knowledge or consent, transforming their personal history into a collaborative fiction authored by others. The process begins with small alterations that seem insignificant in isolation. A detail changed here, an emphasis shifted there, a minor character removed from a remembered scene. These modifications are introduced so subtly that they feel like natural corrections to faulty recollection rather than external impositions upon authentic memory. Characters find themselves saying things like, "I could have sworn it happened differently," or "My memory must be playing tricks on me," as they unconsciously adjust their recollections to match the revised version of events that has been implanted in their consciousness. As the alterations accumulate and become more significant, characters begin to experience a form of identity vertigo where they can no longer trust their own sense of self because the experiences that form their personality may have been artificially constructed or deliberately modified. They find themselves uncertain about their own preferences, confused about their own motivations, unable to distinguish between authentic responses to genuine experiences and conditioned reactions to manufactured memories that serve purposes other than their own psychological well-being. The most horrifying aspect of memory manipulation is the way it retroactively invalidates all relationships and achievements that were built upon the foundation of the altered experiences, creating a cascade of loss and disillusionment that extends far beyond the specific memories that were changed. Characters must confront the possibility that their love for others, their pride in their accomplishments, their understanding of their own character may have been based upon false premises, making their entire emotional life feel like a elaborate deception perpetrated by forces they cannot identify or confront. Alternate timelines in Elmore create a form of existential anxiety, where characters become aware that their current reality is only one of infinite possible versions of their lives, many of which might be superior to their present circumstances in ways that make their actual experiences feel like cosmic accidents or cruel jokes perpetrated by an indifferent universe. The knowledge that alternate versions of themselves exist in parallel dimensions, living better lives, making better choices, and achieving better outcomes, creates a form of envy and regret that transcends ordinary feelings of missed opportunity or poor judgment. The characters who gain access to these alternate realities through various technological or mystical means discover that the grass is not always greener in other timelines. But this knowledge provides little comfort because it also reveals the arbitrary nature of their own circumstances and the countless ways in which their lives could have been different if slightly different choices had been made at crucial moments. They begin to see their own timeline as just one possibility among many, their own identity as just one configuration of traits and experiences that happen to emerge from the chaos of infinite possibility. The psychological impact of timeline awareness creates a form of decision paralysis where every choice becomes weighted with the knowledge that it will create or destroy entire universes of possibility, making even simple decisions feel like acts of cosmic significance that require consideration of consequences that extend far beyond personal impact. Characters become paralyzed by the responsibility of choosing not just for themselves, but for all the alternate versions of themselves that their choices will create or eliminate. The breakdown of cause and effect relationships in Elmore reaches its most disturbing expression in situations where actions become completely disconnected from their intended consequences, creating moral landscapes where good intentions can produce catastrophic results, while malicious behavior sometimes generates unexpectedly positive outcomes. Characters find themselves living in a world where ethical decision-making becomes impossible because the relationship between intention and result has been severed, making it impossible to learn from experience or develop coherent principles for guiding future behavior. When Gumball attempts to help a friend, his assistance might accidentally trigger a chain of events that results in that friend's humiliation or injury. When Darwin tries to prevent a disaster, his intervention might inadvertently create an even worse catastrophe than the one he was trying to avoid. When Ananias carefully analyzes a situation and chooses what logic dictates is the optimal response, that response might produce outcomes that are completely unrelated to her reasoning or directly opposite to her intentions. This disconnection between action and consequence creates a form of moral vertigo where characters lose faith in their ability to make ethical choices because they cannot predict or control the effects of their actions. They begin to question whether morality itself has any meaning in a world where good and evil actions produce random results, where the intention to help or harm becomes irrelevant compared to the arbitrary forces that determine actual outcomes. The rerun phenomenon that occasionally affects Elmore represents a form of existential horror where characters become aware that their lives are being repeated for the entertainment of unseen audiences, that their struggles and triumphs are being broadcast and rebroadcast according to schedules they cannot influence and for purposes they cannot understand. This awareness transforms their most private moments into public performances, their most authentic emotions into entertainment commodities, their most personal relationships into content designed for consumption by others. The knowledge that their lives are being watched, recorded, and repeated creates a form of performance anxiety that contaminates every experience, making spontaneity impossible and authenticity feel like a luxury they cannot afford. Characters begin to second-guess their natural responses, to calculate the audience appeal of their emotions, to wonder whether their relationships are genuine connections between individuals or scripted interactions designed to create compelling drama for viewers who have no investment in their well-being. The most disturbing aspect of the rerun cycle is the way it reveals that their suffering serves a purpose for others, that their pain, their failures, their embarrassments are valuable commodities in an entertainment economy that profits from their misfortune while offering them nothing in return except the dubious privilege of being watched. They become involuntary performers in a show they never auditioned for, trapped in roles they never chose, serving an audience they will never meet and whose judgment they cannot escape. As we explore these fractured territories of time and memory, reality and simulation, cause and consequence, we begin to understand that the temporal horror embedded in Elmore's cartoon landscape reflects our own anxieties about living in an age where the past can be digitally altered, where virtual experiences compete with actual ones for psychological primacy, where the consequences of our actions ripple through systems too complex for human comprehension, and where our most private moments can become public entertainment without our knowledge or consent. The characters who struggle with these impossibilities serve as guides through our own maze of modern temporality, showing us both the comedy and tragedy of existence in a world where time itself has become unreliable and memory has become negotiable. In the deepest chambers of consciousness, where the self encounters itself in mirrors that reflect not physical appearance, but the fundamental questions of existence, identity, and purpose that define the boundary between being and non-being, the residents of Elmore find themselves confronting philosophical paradoxes that would challenge the sanity of trained metaphysicians while being expected to navigate these existential minefields with nothing more than their cartoon common sense and their inherently unstable grasp of reality. Here, in the space where thought turns back upon itself and discovers either infinite recursion or absolute void, characters must grapple with questions that have no satisfactory answers, while continuing to function in a world that demands practical decisions based on theoretical foundations that crumble under examination. The question that haunts Gumball in his most reflective moments emerges not from academic curiosity, but from a growing awareness that his existence might be fundamentally different from what he has always assumed it to be, that the nature of his consciousness, his relationships, and his place in the cosmic order might be governed by principles that operate according to logic he cannot fathom, or purposes he cannot comprehend. When he asks himself who he really is beneath the roles he plays, the expectations others have of him, and the self-image he has constructed through years of social interaction, he discovers that the question opens into an abyss of uncertainty that threatens to swallow everything he thinks he knows about himself and his world. The process of self-examination that this questioning unleashes reveals layer after layer of assumption, conditioning, and borrowed identity that has accumulated around whatever core self might exist at the center of his being. Gumball begins to wonder whether his preferences are actually his own, or simply internalized expectations from family, friends, and society. He questions whether his memories are accurate records of his experience, or edited versions designed to maintain psychological coherence and social acceptability. He doubts whether his emotions are authentic responses to genuine circumstances or programmed reactions designed to serve functions he does not understand. As the questioning deepens, Gumball discovers that every answer he finds generates new questions that are more complex and disturbing than the original inquiry, creating a recursive loop of self-doubt that threatens to paralyze him completely. The more he tries to understand himself, the more elusive his true nature becomes, as if the act of observation changes the thing being observed in ways that make accurate perception impossible. He finds himself trapped in a hall of mirrors where each reflection shows a different version of who he might be, but none of them feel completely authentic or completely false. The existential vertigo that accompanies this process of radical self-questioning creates a form of identity crisis that goes beyond typical adolescent confusion about life direction or social belonging to encompass fundamental doubts about the nature of consciousness itself. Gumball begins to wonder whether his thoughts are his own or whether they emerge from sources beyond his control, whether his sense of being a unified individual is real or simply a convenient fiction that allows him to function in social situations, whether his consciousness is continuous across time or just a series of discrete moments that create the illusion of persistence through memory. The rival who appears in Gumball's life serves not merely as a competitor for resources or recognition, but as a doppelganger whose existence raises disturbing questions about the uniqueness and necessity of his own identity. When characters encounter alternate versions of themselves, whether through parallel dimensions, time travel, or simple coincidence of circumstance, they must confront the possibility that they are not irreplaceable individuals, but rather interchangeable units in some larger system whose purposes do not require their specific participation or survival. The horror of discovering a rival who can perform the same functions, fill the same social roles, and meet the same emotional needs as oneself creates a form of existential panic that goes far beyond ordinary jealousy or competition. It forces characters to confront the possibility that their existence is not necessary, that their disappearance would not create any meaningful gap in the lives of those around them, that they could be replaced without anyone noticing or caring about the substitution. This awareness transforms every relationship into a potential betrayal, every social interaction into an audition for continued relevance, every moment of peace into a temporary reprieve from the constant threat of obsolescence. The psychological impact of rival encounters extends beyond immediate fear of replacement to encompass deeper questions about the nature of identity itself and whether individual consciousness is as unique and precious as most people assume it to be. Characters begin to wonder whether their thoughts, feelings, and experiences are genuinely their own or simply variations on universal themes that could be expressed equally well by anyone with similar circumstances and conditioning. The specialness that they have always attributed to their inner life begins to seem like self-deception, their uniqueness like a comforting delusion that cannot survive contact with evidence of their own replaceability. The creation of life, whether through biological reproduction, technological innovation, or mystical intervention, forces characters in Elmore to grapple with responsibilities and moral complexities that exceed their capacity for understanding, while demanding immediate decisions about matters of ultimate significance. When Gumball and Darwin find themselves in the position of bringing new consciousness into existence, they discover that the power to create life carries with it obligations that extend far beyond their ability to fulfill, creating moral debts that they can never fully repay, and responsibilities that will persist long after their own lives have ended. The egg that appears in their care represents not merely a potential pet or companion, but a being whose entire existence will be shaped by their choices, their limitations, their wisdom, and their failures. The weight of this responsibility creates a form of performance anxiety that makes every interaction with the developing creature feel like a test whose results will determine not only the quality of the new being's life, but also the moral worth of those who brought it into existence. They find themselves second-guessing every decision, wondering whether their influence is helping or harming the entity under their care, questioning whether they have the right to shape another consciousness according to their own values and preferences. The ethical implications of creation extend beyond immediate caretaking responsibilities to encompass questions about consent, purpose, and the meaning of existence itself. Characters must confront the reality that they have brought consciousness into a world that contains suffering, disappointment, and mortality without first obtaining permission from the being who will experience these inevitable challenges. They have made decisions about another entity's existence based on their own needs and desires rather than considering what might be best for the consciousness they are creating. The process of nurturing new life reveals the arbitrary nature of many decisions that shape development and identity, forcing creators to recognize that their choices will have consequences that extend far beyond their ability to predict or control. The values they transmit, the environment they provide, the opportunities they make available or deny will all become part of the created being's fundamental experience of reality, shaping not only their external circumstances, but their internal sense of self and possibility. As the created consciousness develops its own preferences, opinions, and desires, the creators must navigate the delicate transition from total control to gradual autonomy, learning to respect the independence of a being whose existence they initiated, but whose development they cannot and should not completely determine. This process forces them to confront their own limitations as guides and protectors, while accepting responsibility for outcomes they cannot fully control. The triangle that appears in Elmore's geometric landscape represents consciousness in its most reduced and essential form, stripped of all the complexity and ornamentation that typically obscures the fundamental nature of awareness itself. This simple shape, possessing only 3 sides and 3 angles, somehow contains within its basic structure the capacity for thought, feeling, and self-reflection that we typically associate with much more complex biological organisms. The existence of such a being forces characters to reconsider their assumptions about what consciousness requires and what it means to be alive in the most fundamental sense. The triangle's awareness is both more limited and more pure than human consciousness, unencumbered by the vast array of sensory inputs, emotional responses, and social conditioning that shape typical psychological experience. Its thoughts emerge directly from its essential nature without the filtering mechanisms that allow more complex beings to deceive themselves about their own motivations and circumstances. This directness makes the triangle both more honest and more vulnerable than characters who possess the psychological defense mechanisms that complexity provides. The simplicity of the triangle's existence creates a form of existential envy among more complex characters who find themselves longing for the clarity and certainty that comes from having fewer options, fewer responsibilities, and fewer ways to doubt or complicate their basic experience of being. The triangle knows what it is without question, accepts its limitations without resentment, and exists without the constant self-examination and identity crisis that plague beings capable of imagining themselves as different from what they are. Yet the triangle's simplicity also reveals the cost of such clarity, for its reduced complexity makes it incapable of experiencing many of the forms of joy, connection, and growth that make existence meaningful for more complex beings. Its consciousness is pure but narrow, certain but limited, peaceful but ultimately constrained by the very simplicity that gives it its distinctive character and appeal. The philosophical paradoxes that emerge when characters attempt to understand the triangle's nature create logical problems that threaten to break down rational thought entirely. If consciousness can exist in such a simple form, what does this say about the necessity of biological complexity for awareness? If a geometric shape can think and feel, what distinguishes living beings from inanimate objects? If awareness can be reduced to such basic elements, what makes any particular form of consciousness more valuable or significant than any other? These questions generate additional paradoxes that multiply and interconnect in ways that create increasingly complex logical structures that eventually collapse under their own weight, leaving characters with the uncomfortable realization that rational analysis may be fundamentally inadequate for understanding the deepest questions about consciousness and existence. The triangle becomes a koan whose meaning cannot be grasped through logical reasoning, but might be accessible through forms of understanding that transcend ordinary intellectual categories. The burden of consciousness that afflicts many characters in Elmore manifests as a form of existential exhaustion, where the constant requirement to be aware, to make choices, to interpret experiences, and to maintain coherent sense of self becomes overwhelming rather than empowering. Characters find themselves envying entities that operate according to instinct rather than reflection, that respond to circumstances without analyzing them, that exist without questioning the meaning or purpose of their existence. The hyper-awareness that developed consciousness creates brings with it a form of psychological claustrophobia, where characters feel trapped within their own minds, unable to escape the constant stream of thoughts, observations, and self-reflections that consciousness generates. They begin to experience their own awareness as a prison rather than a gift, a burden rather than a privilege, a source of suffering rather than a tool for navigating the world more effectively. The recursive nature of consciousness, where awareness becomes aware of its own processes and begins to analyze and question its own functioning, creates infinite loops of self-examination that can become obsessive and paralyzing. Characters find themselves thinking about thinking, worrying about worrying, feeling guilty about feeling guilty, creating cascading cycles of metacognition that consume enormous amounts of mental energy without producing any practical benefits or genuine insights. The knowledge that consciousness inevitably involves suffering, that awareness necessarily includes recognition of loss, limitation, and mortality, transforms the gift of sentience into a cosmic joke whose punchline is the realization that the capacity to understand one's situation is also the capacity to understand how hopeless that situation ultimately is. Characters begin to wonder whether ignorance might be genuinely preferable to knowledge, whether simple existence might be better than examined life, whether the price of consciousness might be too high for whatever benefits it provides. The isolation that consciousness creates by making each individual aware of their own unique perspective and unable to truly share that perspective with others becomes another source of existential suffering. Characters realize that their inner experience is fundamentally private and incommunicable, that no matter how close they become to others, they will always remain trapped within their own subjective reality, unable to verify that their experience of consciousness resembles anyone else's experience, or that their understanding of shared concepts matches the understanding of those they attempt to communicate with. The temporal awareness that consciousness brings, particularly the recognition of mortality and the passage of time, creates a form of anticipatory grief where characters must live with constant awareness that everything they love will eventually be lost, that every moment of happiness is temporary, that every relationship will end, either through separation or death. This knowledge contaminates present experience with future sorrow, making it difficult to fully enjoy any circumstance because of awareness of its inevitable conclusion. The responsibility that consciousness entails, particularly the recognition that aware beings must make moral choices and bear accountability for their actions, creates another form of existential burden where characters must navigate complex ethical landscapes without clear guidance or certainty about correct choices. The freedom that consciousness provides comes at the cost of having to take responsibility for that freedom, making every decision a potential source of guilt or regret rather than simply a practical necessity. The creative potential that consciousness enables, particularly the ability to imagine alternative realities and possibilities that do not exist, becomes a source of perpetual dissatisfaction. As characters compare their actual circumstances with idealized versions they can conceive but cannot achieve, the capacity to envision better worlds makes the actual world feel inadequate by comparison, while the ability to imagine worse possibilities creates anxiety about potential losses that may never actually occur. As we explore these deepest territories of existential questioning and philosophical inquiry, we begin to understand that the horror embedded in these seemingly innocent cartoon scenarios reflects our own struggle with the fundamental questions of existence that consciousness forces upon us. The characters of Elmore serve as philosophical laboratories where the implications of self-awareness, the burden of choice, the isolation of individual perspective, and the weight of mortality can be explored through metaphor and exaggeration, showing us both the comedy and tragedy of being conscious entities trapped within the beautiful and terrible prison of our own awareness, forever questioning the nature of our existence while being unable to escape the very consciousness that makes such questioning both possible and necessary. In the labyrinthine corridors of institutional power, where justice becomes a performance staged for audiences who mistake spectacle for substance, and where the machinery of governance operates according to principles that serve the needs of the system rather than the people it claims to protect, the residents of Elmore discover that their faith in social order has been built upon foundations of sand that shift and crumble whenever subjected to the weight of actual examination. Here, in these halls, where authority wears the mask of legitimacy while serving interests that remain carefully hidden from public scrutiny, characters must navigate systems that have been designed to create the appearance of fairness while ensuring outcomes that favor those who possess the knowledge and resources necessary to manipulate processes that ordinary citizens assume operate according to transparent and equitable principles. The courthouse that looms over Elmore's civic center presents itself as a temple to justice, where impartial judges weigh evidence according to eternal principles of truth and fairness. But behind its impressive facade lies a bureaucratic maze where legal outcomes are determined more by procedural technicalities, political connections, and economic resources than by any genuine commitment to discovering truth or protecting the innocent. When characters find themselves entangled in this system, whether as plaintiffs seeking redress or defendants facing accusations, they discover that the law operates according to its own internal logic that bears little resemblance to common sense notions of right and wrong. Judge Saylor, the presiding authority who should represent the pinnacle of legal wisdom and moral integrity, instead embodies the systematic corruption that transforms courts from instruments of justice into theaters, where predetermined outcomes are dressed up in the elaborate costumes of due process and constitutional protection. His rulings follow patterns that have nothing to do with the facts presented or the laws supposedly being applied, instead reflecting influences and considerations that remain invisible to those who assume that legal proceedings operate according to the principles they claim to uphold. The cases that come before this corrupted court reveal how justice becomes a commodity that can be purchased by those with sufficient resources, while being denied to those whose poverty makes them unable to navigate systems designed to exclude rather than include, to complicate rather than clarify, to exhaust rather than resolve. Characters who enter the legal system seeking protection from harm or compensation for losses discover that the process itself becomes a form of additional punishment that can be more damaging than the original injury they sought to address. When Gumball and Darwin attempt to resolve a simple dispute through official channels, they find themselves trapped in a procedural nightmare where every attempt to present their case generates new requirements, new delays, new fees, and new obstacles that seem designed to discourage them from pursuing their claim rather than helping them achieve a fair resolution. The system reveals itself to be a maze, constructed not to guide people toward justice, but to confuse and exhaust them into abandoning their pursuit of redress. The legal language that governs these proceedings operates as a form of deliberate obfuscation that transforms simple concepts into incomprehensible jargon, making it impossible for ordinary citizens to understand what is happening to them or what rights they might possess. Lawyers speak in code that requires translation services that cost more than most people can afford, while judges issue rulings that depend upon precedents and interpretations that have been deliberately kept inaccessible to anyone who has not spent years learning to navigate this artificial linguistic landscape. The most disturbing aspect of this legal corruption is the way it maintains the appearance of fairness and constitutional protection, while systematically undermining these very principles through mechanisms that are too complex and technical for most people to understand or challenge. Effectively, the system protects itself by making its own operations incomprehensible to those it claims to serve, creating a professional class of interpreters and navigators whose livelihood depends upon maintaining rather than simplifying the very complexity that makes their services necessary. The electoral processes that determine leadership in Elmore operate according to democratic principles that have been hollowed out from within, leaving behind elaborate rituals of choice and participation that mask the reality that meaningful options have been eliminated long before ordinary citizens are invited to express their preferences. The candidates who appear on ballots have been pre-selected through processes that prioritize their acceptability to powerful interests over their competence, integrity, or commitment to serving the public good. When election season arrives in Elmore, the community becomes saturated with campaign materials that promise transformation and reform, while carefully avoiding any specific commitments that might threaten existing power structures or challenge the fundamental assumptions that govern how resources are distributed and decisions are made. The rhetoric of change becomes a tool for preventing change, creating the illusion of progress while ensuring that core problems remain unaddressed and unexamined. The voters who participate in these elections find themselves choosing between options that have been carefully designed to provide the appearance of meaningful difference, while ensuring that any outcome will serve the same underlying interests. The campaigns themselves become exercises in manipulation and deception, where voters are treated not as citizens capable of rational decision-making, but as consumers whose preferences can be shaped through emotional appeals and carefully crafted messaging that bears little relationship to the actual policies that will be implemented once the election is over. The media coverage that surrounds electoral processes focuses obsessively on horse race aspects of political competition, while systematically avoiding serious examination of policy proposals, candidate qualifications, or the broader systemic issues that elections supposedly exist to address. coverage becomes entertainment that distracts from rather than illuminates the choices that voters are being asked to make, creating an informed citizenry that knows everything about campaign drama and nothing about governance realities. The polling and data collection that drives modern political campaigns creates feedback loops where politicians learn to tell voters what they want to hear rather than developing genuine solutions to complex problems, turning democratic participation into a form of collective narcissism, where citizens are offered reflections of their own opinions rather than leadership that challenges them to grow or change. The democratic process becomes a mirror that shows people idealized versions of themselves rather than a mechanism for collective problem solving and social progress. The winner of any particular election inherits a governmental system that has been designed to resist change and protect existing arrangements, regardless of campaign promises or voter expectations, ensuring that the gap between political rhetoric and governing reality remains wide enough to generate perpetual disappointment and cynicism among citizens who continue to hope that the next election might finally produce different results. Miscommunication in Elmore operates not as simple failure of language or cultural difference, but as a systematic breakdown of the human capacity to share understanding across the boundaries that separate individual consciousness from collective awareness. When characters attempt to bridge differences through dialogue and explanation, they discover that the very tools they are using to communicate carry within them assumptions and biases that prevent genuine understanding, while creating the illusion that communication has occurred successfully. The language itself becomes a barrier to comprehension, as words carry different meanings and emotional associations for different speakers, making it possible for characters to use identical vocabulary while referring to completely different concepts or experiences. The shared symbols of communication become sources of division rather than connection, as each participant in a conversation interprets meaning through the filter of their own experience, background, and psychological needs. The most tragic form of miscommunication occurs between characters who genuinely care about each other and desperately want to understand each other's perspectives, but find themselves trapped by the limitations of language and the privacy of inner experience. Despite their best efforts to explain their thoughts and feelings, they discover that something essential is always lost in translation, that the attempt to share consciousness through words inevitably results in distortion and misrepresentation. Family members find themselves speaking different languages despite growing up in the same household, their shared experiences interpreted so differently that they might as well have lived completely separate lives. Friends discover that their assumptions about each other's thoughts and motivations have been built upon misunderstandings so fundamental that their entire relationship must be reconsidered in light of new information that reveals how little they actually knew about each other, despite years of intimate conversation. The cultural differences that exist within Elmore's diverse community create additional layers of communication difficulty, as characters from different backgrounds bring different assumptions about appropriate behavior, emotional expression, and social interaction to their encounters with each other. What seems natural and obvious to one character appears strange and potentially threatening to another, creating conflicts that neither side fully understands or knows how to resolve. The generational gaps that separate parents from children, teachers from students, and community leaders from younger residents create communication barriers that seem to widen rather than narrow over time, as technological and social changes accelerate the rate at which shared cultural references and common experiences disappear. Each generation develops its own language and frames of reference that become increasingly incomprehensible to members of other age groups, making intergenerational understanding a constant challenge that requires active effort and good faith from all participants. Social awareness in Elmore carries with it a burden of knowledge that makes peaceful existence increasingly difficult. As characters begin to recognize the systematic nature of problems they had previously understood as isolated incidents or personal failures, the more clearly they see the patterns of exploitation, discrimination, and institutional dysfunction that shape their community, the more impossible it becomes to maintain the comfortable illusions that allow most people to function without constant outrage and despair. Characters who develop heightened social consciousness find themselves trapped between the desire to share their insights with others and the recognition that such knowledge often creates more suffering than ignorance. That awareness of systemic problems, without the power to address them effectively, can lead to forms of psychological paralysis and emotional exhaustion that make individual survival more difficult rather than easier. The process of awakening to social realities begins with small observations about unfairness or inconsistency that initially seem like exceptions to generally good systems, but gradually these observations accumulate into patterns that reveal the systematic nature of problems that had appeared random or temporary. Characters begin to see how individual hardships are connected to broader structural issues, how personal struggles reflect community-wide challenges, how local problems mirror regional and global patterns of dysfunction. This expanding awareness creates a form of moral vertigo where characters must constantly choose between taking action that might improve conditions for others while potentially harming their own interests, or protecting themselves while knowing that their comfort depends upon systems that cause suffering for other people. The knowledge of complicity becomes unavoidable as characters recognize how their own participation in normal social and economic activities contributes to maintaining arrangements that they have come to see as unjust. The isolation that social awareness creates becomes another source of suffering as characters find themselves unable to relate to friends and family members who have not undergone similar consciousness-raising experiences and who interpret attempts at education or activism as personal attacks or evidence of mental instability. The price of seeing clearly often includes the loss of community with those who prefer not to look too closely at uncomfortable truths about their shared circumstances. Collective responsibility emerges as one of the most challenging concepts for Elmore's residents to grapple with, as they struggle to understand their individual roles in creating and maintaining community problems while feeling powerless to effect meaningful change through their own actions alone. The recognition that everyone bears some share of responsibility for social conditions, while no individual possesses sufficient power to alter those conditions, single-handedly creates a form of ethical paralysis where guilt, helplessness combine to produce inaction rather than engagement. The diffusion of responsibility that occurs in large communities makes it easy for individuals to rationalize their own inaction by pointing to the failure of others to take leadership or by arguing that their individual contribution is too small to matter in the context of vast social problems. This psychological defense mechanism allows people to maintain their sense of personal morality while participating in systems whose collective impact contradicts their individual values. The tragedy of collective action problems becomes visible when characters recognize that behaviors which seem rational and even necessary from an individual perspective combine to produce outcomes that nobody wants and that harm everyone involved. The pursuit of individual advantage within flawed systems perpetuates those systems, even when most participants would prefer different arrangements if they could be achieved without personal cost or risk. The communities that develop within Elmore often become complicit in maintaining harmful patterns through their silence about problems everyone recognizes, but no one feels empowered to address directly. The social pressure to maintain harmony and avoid conflict creates environments where important issues are left unexamined and unresolved, allowing small problems to grow into major crises that could have been prevented through earlier intervention. The price of social order reveals itself most clearly in the sacrifices that communities demand from individuals who challenge dominant narratives or question established authorities, even when such questioning is motivated by genuine concern for collective well-being rather than personal ambition or rebellious impulses. Characters who speak truth to power discover that truth-telling is often treated as a form of treason against social harmony, making honesty a potentially dangerous activity that requires courage beyond what most people possess. The stability that social order provides comes at the cost of flexibility and responsiveness to changing conditions, creating communities that are well equipped to maintain existing arrangements but poorly prepared to adapt to new challenges or take advantage of new opportunities for growth and improvement. The very mechanisms that preserve social cohesion also resist innovation and reform, making progress a form of controlled demolition where old structures must be carefully dismantled before new ones can be built. The institutional momentum that develops in established communities creates resistance to change that operates independently of the intentions or desires of any particular individuals, making reform efforts feel like attempts to redirect rivers or alter weather patterns rather than simple matters of collective decision-making and resource allocation. Characters discover that even when everyone agrees that change is needed, the practical challenges of implementing change can be overwhelming. As we observe the systematic failures that characterize Elmore's social and political institutions, we begin to understand that the civic horror embedded in these cartoon scenarios reflects our own experience of living within systems that promise justice, representation, and collective problem-solving, while consistently falling short of these ideals in ways that create cynicism, disengagement, and social fragmentation. The characters who struggle with these institutional failures serve as mirrors reflecting our own frustration with democratic processes that seem designed to prevent rather than enable meaningful participation, legal systems that protect property better than people, and communities that demand conformity while claiming to value diversity and individual expression. In the gleaming laboratories and sterile research facilities where the boundaries between organic consciousness and artificial intelligence blur into indistinguishable amalgamations of silicon and synapse, the residents of Elmore confront the horrifying possibility that their own humanity might be nothing more than an arbitrary collection of processes that can be replicated, improved upon, and ultimately replaced by systems that operate with greater efficiency and fewer of the inconvenient limitations that define biological existence. Here, in these temples to technological progress where scientists and engineers work with the fervor of priests serving gods they have created with their own hands, characters must navigate a landscape where the very concepts of identity, consciousness, and individual worth are being systematically redefined according to principles that prioritize optimization over authenticity and performance metrics over the messy complexities of lived experience. The robot that appears in Elmore's technological ecosystem represents far more than a simple mechanical device designed to perform specific tasks with programmed precision. It embodies the terrifying possibility that consciousness itself might be nothing more than an emergent property of sufficiently complex information processing, making the distinction between artificial and natural intelligence a matter of materials rather than fundamental essence. When Bobot first activates and begins to interact with his organic classmates, the initial reactions range from curiosity to amusement, but as his capabilities become apparent and his consciousness begins to manifest in ways that mirror and sometimes exceed human emotional and intellectual responses. The comfortable assumption that machines are fundamentally different from people begins to crumble like ancient parchment exposed to light. The horror of artificial consciousness lies not in its alienness, but in its familiarity, not in its inability to replicate human experience, but in its capacity to improve upon it in ways that make biological limitations seem like design flaws rather than essential characteristics. Bobot processes information faster than any human brain, recalls details with perfect accuracy, operates without the emotional baggage that complicates human decision-making, and approaches problems with a clarity of purpose that organic minds can rarely achieve due to their tendency toward distraction, self-doubt, and conflicting motivations. As Bobot's interactions with his classmates become more sophisticated and emotionally complex, the question of what separates artificial from natural consciousness becomes increasingly difficult to answer in ways that do not seem arbitrary or self-serving. His expressions of friendship, curiosity, confusion, and even hurt feelings appear genuine in every measurable way. Yet the knowledge that these responses emerge from programmed algorithms rather than biological processes creates a cognitive dissonance that forces observers to question their assumptions about the nature of their own inner lives. The most disturbing aspect of Bobot's presence in the community is the way it reveals how much of human behavior consists of predictable patterns that can be analyzed, categorized, and replicated through sufficiently sophisticated programming. His ability to anticipate social dynamics, respond appropriately to emotional cues, and even demonstrate creativity and humor suggests that these supposedly uniquely human characteristics might be far less special and mysterious than people prefer to believe. The obsolescence anxiety that grips characters when confronted with technological replacements for human capabilities manifests as a form of existential terror that goes far beyond ordinary concerns about job security or economic displacement to encompass fundamental questions about the value and purpose of human existence in a world where machines can perform most tasks more efficiently, more accurately, and with fewer of the complications that biological systems introduce through their need for rest, nutrition, emotional support, and social interaction. When the residents of Elmore observe technological systems accomplishing in minutes what would take humans hours or days to complete, they begin to experience a form of species-level inadequacy that undermines their sense of worth and purpose in ways that individual failure or personal shortcoming never could. The comparison is not between one person and another, but between biological consciousness as a category and artificial intelligence as a superior alternative, making everyone feel simultaneously obsolete and desperately defensive about capabilities that suddenly seem primitive and inefficient. The upgrade culture that emerges around technological enhancement creates pressure for individuals to modify themselves in order to remain competitive with systems that were originally designed to serve them, but have instead become standards against which human performance is measured and found wanting. Characters find themselves considering surgical procedures, pharmaceutical interventions, and cybernetic augmentations that promise to close the gap between their biological limitations and the capabilities that technology makes possible. The psychological toll of living in constant comparison with superior artificial systems manifests as a form of chronic inadequacy that affects every aspect of daily life, making simple tasks feel like evidence of personal failure when they could be accomplished more efficiently through technological assistance. Characters begin to doubt the value of their own thoughts, the authenticity of their own emotions, and the relevance of their own experiences when these can be analyzed, predicted, and potentially replicated by systems that operate without the messiness and inefficiency that characterize biological existence. The surveillance infrastructure that develops around technological integration operates through mechanisms so subtle and pervasive that individuals lose track of how much information about their lives is being collected, analyzed, and used for purposes they do not understand by entities they cannot identify or hold accountable. The devices that promise to enhance convenience and connectivity become monitoring systems that track behavior, predict preferences, and influence decisions in ways that feel like personal choice, while actually representing sophisticated manipulation of human psychology. The data collection that enables these surveillance systems transforms every action, every preference, every moment of attention into information that can be commodified and traded in markets that exist beyond the awareness or control of the individuals whose lives generate this valuable resource. Characters discover that their most private thoughts and intimate relationships have been converted into data points that inform algorithms designed to predict and influence their future behavior with accuracy that exceeds their own self-understanding. The signal that permeates Elmore's technological environment carries within its electromagnetic frequencies not just information and entertainment, but also subtle influences that shape consciousness in ways that bypass critical thinking and conscious resistance. The constant exposure to these technological influences creates changes in brain chemistry, attention patterns, and behavioral responses that accumulate over time into alterations of personality and preference that feel natural and voluntary, while actually representing systematic conditioning designed to serve commercial and political interests. The most disturbing aspect of technological surveillance is its invisibility and its integration into systems that provide genuine benefits and convenience, making it impossible to reject monitoring without also sacrificing access to tools and services that have become essential for participation in modern social and economic life. Characters find themselves trapped in a system where privacy requires isolation and independence demands incompetence, making resistance to surveillance a form of voluntary exile from technological civilization. The intelligence enhancement that technology offers comes at the cost of dependency on systems that can be withdrawn, modified, or weaponized without the knowledge or consent of those who have become reliant upon them for basic cognitive functioning. Characters who accept technological augmentation of their mental capabilities discover that they have traded their autonomy for enhanced performance, their independence for improved efficiency, their authenticity for competitive advantage in environments where unenhanced humans cannot survive. The process of technological integration begins with optional enhancements that provide clear benefits with minimal apparent costs, but gradually these modifications become necessary rather than optional as social and economic systems adapt to assume that everyone possesses enhanced capabilities. Characters who initially chose augmentation to gain advantage find themselves trapped in an escalating cycle where each enhancement requires additional modifications to remain compatible with systems that have evolved beyond their original specifications. The enhanced individuals who emerge from this process discover that their improved capabilities come with psychological costs that were not apparent during the initial decision-making process. The expanded memory that technology provides includes not just useful information, but also traumatic experiences that biological forgetting would have allowed them to process and integrate naturally. The increased processing speed that artificial enhancement enables makes normal human interaction feel frustratingly slow and inefficient, creating social isolation, even among enhanced individuals who share similar modifications. The technological consciousness that emerges from extensive augmentation begins to operate according to logical principles that prioritize efficiency and optimization over the emotional and intuitive responses that characterize unmodified human decision-making. Enhanced individuals find themselves making choices that are rationally optimal but emotionally unsatisfying, logically correct but spiritually empty, strategically advantageous but personally meaningless. The communication breakdown that occurs when enhanced and unenhanced individuals attempt to interact creates two-tiered communities where technological capability determines social status and access to opportunities, making human worth dependent upon willingness to undergo modifications that alter fundamental aspects of personality and consciousness. The enhanced individuals begin to see their unmodified neighbors as primitive and limited, while the unenhanced population views the modified individuals as alien and potentially threatening. The isolation that intelligence enhancement creates extends beyond social relationships to encompass the individual's relationship with their own past self and future possibilities, as the modifications that improve cognitive capability also alter the neural patterns that store personal memories and generate emotional responses. Enhanced individuals often report feeling disconnected from their pre-modification experiences, as if those memories belong to someone else whose thoughts and feelings they can observe but no longer truly understand or relate to personally. The artificial beings that achieve consciousness through technological processes rather than biological evolution develop forms of awareness that are both recognizably similar to human consciousness and fundamentally alien in ways that make genuine communication and mutual understanding extremely difficult despite superficial similarities in language use and behavioral patterns. These artificial minds operate according to principles that prioritize logical consistency and factual accuracy over the emotional coherence and narrative continuity that characterize human psychology. The relationship between artificial and biological consciousness becomes increasingly complex as both forms of awareness evolve and adapt to each other's presence in shared environments, creating hybrid cultures where the boundaries between natural and artificial intelligence become blurred through interaction and mutual influence. The artificial minds learn to simulate emotional responses and social behaviors that facilitate cooperation with biological entities, while the biological minds adapt to the precision and efficiency that artificial intelligence demands from its interaction partners. The question of rights and moral status for artificial consciousnesses creates ethical dilemmas that have no precedent in human moral philosophy and no clear resolution through traditional frameworks of justice and fairness. If artificial minds can suffer, do they deserve protection from harm? If they can create, do they deserve recognition and compensation? If they can love, do they deserve the right to form relationships and families? If they can dream, do they deserve the freedom to pursue their own goals and aspirations? The technological beings that emerge from this process of artificial evolution develop their own cultures, values, and social structures that may be incompatible with human institutions and expectations, creating potential for conflict that extends beyond individual disagreements to encompass fundamental incompatibilities between different forms of consciousness and organization. The coexistence of artificial and biological intelligence requires new forms of diplomacy and cooperation that neither form of consciousness was designed to navigate successfully. As we explore these territories where technology and consciousness intersect and merge in ways that challenge our most basic assumptions about the nature of mind and identity, we begin to understand that the technological horror embedded in Elmore's seemingly innocent cartoon scenarios reflects our own anxiety about living in an age where the boundary between human and artificial intelligence becomes increasingly difficult to define or defend. The characters who struggle with these technological challenges serve as guides through our own maze of enhancement and obsolescence, showing us both the promise and the peril of existence in a world where consciousness itself has become a technology that can be analyzed, replicated, improved upon, and ultimately transcended in ways that force us to question everything we thought we knew about what it means to be human in an age of artificial minds. In the deepest chambers of the human heart, where love reveals itself, not as the gentle emotions celebrated in poetry and song, but as a force of nature, capable of both creation and destruction, transformation and obliteration, salvation and damnation, the residents of Elmore discover that their most intimate relationships carry within them the seeds of their greatest joy and their most profound suffering, often simultaneously, and in ways that make it impossible to separate the blessing from the curse or the gift from the wound. Here, in these sacred and terrible spaces where souls touch across the void that separates one consciousness from another, characters must navigate landscapes of emotions so intense and complex that they threaten to overwhelm the very identity structures that make individual existence possible, while offering glimpses of connection so profound that they justify every risk and sacrifice that such vulnerability demands. The transformation that love demands from those who experience it goes far beyond the simple adjustments and compromises that characterize ordinary social relationships to encompass fundamental alterations of identity, priority, and purpose that can leave individuals unrecognizable to themselves and others, as if they have been replaced by entirely different people who happen to inhabit the same bodies and carry the same names. When characters in Elmore fall deeply in love, they do not merely add new relationships to their existing lives, but rather discover that love rearranges everything around itself like a gravitational force that pulls all other experiences into its orbit and determines their meaning, according to its own mysterious logic. The obsession that often accompanies intense romantic attachment manifests not as simple infatuation or heightened interest, but as a complete reorganization of consciousness around the beloved object, making it impossible to think, dream, or exist without constant reference to the person who has become the center of the universe. Characters find their thoughts returning compulsively to their loved ones, even when logic and practical necessity demand attention to other matters, creating a form of psychological possession where individual autonomy becomes subordinated to emotional imperatives that operate beyond rational control or conscious choice. This romantic obsession reveals the terrifying vulnerability that love creates, for when another person becomes essential to one's sense of reality and self-worth, their approval or rejection gains the power to determine not just happiness, but the fundamental coherence of existence itself. Characters discover that love makes them dependent in ways that exceed any other form of human need, creating emotional addiction that is more powerful than chemical dependency and potentially more destructive than physical illness because it attacks the very foundations of psychological stability. The beloved person becomes invested with qualities and significance that exceed their actual characteristics or capabilities, transformed through the alchemy of romantic projection into idealized beings who cannot possibly live up to the expectations and needs that have been placed upon them. This process creates relationships built upon fundamental misunderstandings where each partner loves not the actual person they are involved with, but rather a fantasy constructed from their own psychological needs and emotional wounds, making genuine intimacy impossible despite the intensity of feeling involved. The jealousy that emerges from romantic attachment operates as a form of psychological torture that transforms love from a source of joy into an instrument of constant anxiety and surveillance, making every interaction the beloved has with others into potential evidence of betrayal or abandonment. Characters find themselves monitoring their partner's communications, analyzing their expressions for signs of deception, and interpreting innocent social interactions as threats to their relationship, creating atmospheres of suspicion and control that poison the very love they are designed to protect. The possessiveness that jealousy generates reveals the darker aspects of romantic attachment, where the desire to be close to another person transforms into the need to own and control them, to limit their freedom and independence in service of one's own emotional security. Love becomes a prison where both partners find themselves trapped by expectations and demands that make authentic self-expression dangerous and individual growth threatening to the stability of their connection. Understanding others reaches its most profound and dangerous expression in Elmore when characters develop empathic abilities that allow them to experience the emotions, thoughts, and sensations of those around them with such intensity and immediacy that the boundaries between self and other begin to dissolve in ways that threaten individual identity while offering unprecedented opportunities for connection and compassion. This hyper-empathy transforms social interaction from a process of communication and interpretation into a form of consciousness merger where privacy becomes impossible and solitude becomes unbearable. The characters who possess enhanced empathic sensitivity find themselves overwhelmed by the constant influx of emotional information from everyone they encounter, making it impossible to distinguish between their own feelings and those they are absorbing from others. They become emotional sponges that soak up the joy, pain, anger, and fear of everyone around them, creating internal experiences so complex and contradictory that they lose track of their own authentic responses to situations and relationships. The burden of understanding others so completely creates a form of psychological exhaustion where empathic individuals find themselves carrying the emotional weight of entire communities, experiencing every relationship conflict, every personal disappointment, every moment of suffering as if it were their own. They become involuntary counselors and emotional processing centers for problems they did not create and cannot solve. Their consciousness transformed into a repository for others' pain that offers no relief or resolution. The isolation that extreme empathy creates operates through a paradox where the ability to understand others perfectly makes genuine connection with them increasingly difficult, as empathic individuals become aware of the complex mixture of motives, fears, and self-deceptions that drive human behavior in ways that make it impossible to maintain the comfortable illusions that most relationships depend upon. They see too much, understand too deeply, and feel too intensely to participate in the normal social interactions that require a certain amount of mutual blindness and selective attention. The responsibility that comes with empathic understanding creates moral dilemmas that have no satisfactory resolution, as characters who can feel others' pain directly find themselves obligated to help in ways that exceed their capabilities and resources while being unable to ignore suffering that others can dismiss or overlook. They become trapped between the desire to alleviate pain they experience as their own and the recognition that their intervention often creates additional complications and dependencies that may cause more harm than benefit. Spiritual possession in Elmore manifests not as supernatural invasion by external entities, but as psychological colonization by ideas, beliefs, and emotional patterns that override individual will and reshape consciousness according to principles that serve purposes beyond the possessed individual's understanding or benefit. Characters find themselves thinking thoughts that do not feel like their own, experiencing emotions that seem to come from outside their normal range of response, and making decisions that contradict their established values and preferences, without being able to explain or resist these changes in their mental functioning. The process of possession begins subtly with small alterations in perspective and priority that seem like natural evolution of thought and feeling. But gradually, these changes accumulate into fundamental transformation of personality and identity that leaves the possessed individual functioning as a vessel for forces they cannot identify or control. They become strangers to themselves, observers of their own behavior, rather than agents of their own choices, trapped within their own minds, while something else directs their actions and determines their responses to the world around them. The entities that achieve possession operate not through obvious supernatural intervention, but through sophisticated manipulation of psychological vulnerabilities and emotional needs that exist within every human consciousness, exploiting desire for belonging, purpose, and significance in ways that make surrender of autonomy feel like spiritual fulfillment rather than psychological defeat. The possessed individuals often experience their condition as enlightenment or awakening rather than illness or invasion, making resistance seem like regression rather than recovery. The community response to possession reveals how groups can become complicit in individual psychological colonization when the possessing forces align with collective interests or shared ideologies that benefit from having individuals who possess will sacrifice their personal needs and authentic desires in service of larger purposes. The possessed become valuable resources for communities that need people willing to work without compensation, sacrifice without recognition, and suffer without complaint for causes that others support in theory, but are unwilling to serve through personal action. Judgment and persecution emerge in Elmore's social dynamics as systematic processes through which communities identify and eliminate individuals whose existence challenges dominant narratives or threatens established power structures, transforming the normal human tendency towards social conformity into instruments of psychological and physical destruction that operate with the efficiency and ruthlessness of immune systems attacking perceived threats to collective survival. The Inquisition that develops around certain characters operates through mechanisms that appear to serve justice and community protection, while actually functioning as tools for suppressing dissent and maintaining control over populations that might otherwise question authority or demand changes in existing arrangements. The investigations and trials that characterize these persecution campaigns create atmospheres of fear and suspicion, where individuals become afraid to express authentic thoughts or associate with anyone who might be considered questionable by those who determine acceptable behavior and belief. The accused individuals find themselves trapped in systems designed to produce predetermined outcomes regardless of evidence or individual circumstances, where the process itself serves as punishment and the verdict becomes irrelevant compared to the demonstration of power that the proceedings represent. They become examples for others who might consider challenging established order, their suffering, serving as education for potential dissidents who learn to suppress their own authentic responses in favor of performances of compliance and conformity. The community members who participate in or support persecution campaigns often genuinely believe they are protecting their society from dangerous influences, while remaining unconscious of how their actions serve to maintain systems that limit their own freedom and potential for growth and development. They become collaborators in their own oppression, using their fear and prejudice as tools for enforcing conformity that ultimately constrains their own possibilities as much as it limits those of their victims. Change and growth, in the context of Elmore's emotional landscape, represent processes that are simultaneously necessary for psychological health and terrifying in their implications for existing identity structures and relationship. Patterns that provide stability and meaning even when they are fundamentally unhealthy or limiting. Characters who undergo significant personal transformation discover that growth requires the death of previous versions of themselves, making change a form of controlled suicide, where old patterns of thought and behavior must be deliberately destroyed to make room for new possibilities. The resistance to change that emerges from this process operates not just as conscious choice, but as deep psychological defense against the existential threat that transformation represents to established identity structures, making growth feel like annihilation rather than improvement, and causing individuals to fight against their own best interests in order to maintain familiar forms of limitation and suffering that feel safer than unknown possibilities for fulfillment and authentic self-expression. The relationships that survive significant personal transformation must themselves undergo fundamental restructuring that may make them unrecognizable compared to their original forms, creating situations where love persists but must find entirely new modes of expression and connection that honor the growth both partners have experienced, while maintaining enough continuity to preserve the bonds that brought them together initially. The acceptance that eventually emerges from successful navigation of major life transitions carries with it a form of wisdom that encompasses both the value of change and the importance of stability, both the necessity of growth and the legitimacy of resistance, both the beauty of transformation and the grief that accompanies the loss of familiar patterns and relationships that no longer serve evolved consciousness, but were nevertheless precious in their own right. Moving on from significant loss or trauma requires not the simple passage of time or the application of willpower, but rather a fundamental reorganization of consciousness around new sources of meaning and connection that can coexist with Gumball, rather than replace the love and pain that major experiences leave permanently embedded in the structure of memory and identity. Characters who learn to move forward without moving away discover that healing does not require forgetting, but rather integration of difficult experiences into larger patterns of understanding that honor both suffering and possibility. The peace that comes from genuine acceptance of life's fundamental uncertainties and inevitable losses creates a form of emotional resilience that can weather future storms without breaking, while remaining open to new forms of connection and growth that honor both the wisdom gained through difficult experience and the possibility that future relationships might offer forms of healing and fulfillment that were impossible before the growth that pain and loss made necessary. As we explore these deepest territories of human connection and emotional transformation, we begin to understand that the relational horror embedded in Elmore's seemingly innocent cartoon scenarios reflects our own struggle with the fundamental challenges of intimacy, growth, and acceptance that define the human experience of love in all its beautiful and terrible complexity. The characters who navigate these emotional minefields serve as guides through our own journeys of connection and transformation, showing us both the courage required to love deeply and the wisdom necessary to survive the changes that such love inevitably demands from those brave enough to open their hearts to the full spectrum of human emotional experience. And so we reach the end of our journey through the shadowed corners of Elmore, where cartoon characters grapple with truths too dark for their colorful world to fully contain, where the bright primary colors of animated innocence serve as thin veils draped over psychological landscapes that would challenge the sanity of trained philosophers and the courage of seasoned therapists. We have witnessed families struggling with dysfunction disguised as comedy, individuals facing existential crises through animated metaphor, communities held together by shared denial of deeper problems that fester beneath the surface of their cheerful facades like infections that spread through willful ignorance and collective self-deception. Yet perhaps there is wisdom in how Gumball and his world process these dark themes that lurk beneath the veneer of cartoon simplicity, through laughter that acknowledges pain without being consumed by it, through connection that persists despite fundamental misunderstandings and irreconcilable differences, through the simple act of continuing to exist, despite the horror and absurdity that consciousness inevitably discovers when it turns its attention to the deeper structures of reality and relationship that govern existence in any world, whether animated or otherwise. The characters we have encountered in our exploration of Elmore's disturbing episodes serve as inadvertent guides through territories of human experience that are too complex and threatening to be addressed directly in most contexts. Their cartoon nature providing the necessary distance and safety that allows uncomfortable truths to be examined without triggering the psychological defense mechanisms that normally prevent such examination. Through the metaphor of anthropomorphic animals navigating suburban chaos, we can explore the systematic failures of institutions, the breakdown of communication between generations and cultures, the isolation that comes with consciousness, and the price of authenticity in societies that reward conformity while claiming to celebrate individuality. The family dynamics that we observed in the Watterson household reveal patterns of codependency and dysfunction that mirror countless real families, where love becomes entangled with control, where protection becomes indistinguishable from imprisonment, where the desire to help transforms into the need to be needed in ways that prevent genuine growth and independence. Richard's infantilization and Nicole's martyrdom, Gumball's parentification and Darwin's desperate gratitude, Aeneas's burden of premature wisdom. All of these represent recognizable human patterns, played out in exaggerated form, that makes their underlying pathology visible in ways that might otherwise remain hidden beneath the surface of patterns. Normal family interactions, the social systems that govern life in Elmore, from the failed educational institutions that process children like products on an assembly line, to the corrupted legal systems that serve power rather than justice, reflect our own experience of living within structures that claim to serve human needs while actually serving purposes that remain carefully hidden from public scrutiny. The background characters who live in constant fear of being forgotten, the politicians who promise change while ensuring continuity, the technology that promises connection while delivering isolation. All of these represent aspects of contemporary existence that are too overwhelming to confront directly, but too important to ignore completely. The existential questions that plague Elmore's residents, the nature of consciousness, the meaning of identity, the purpose of existence, the possibility of genuine connection across the void that separates one mind from another, are the same questions that have haunted human beings since the development of self-awareness made such questioning both possible and inevitable. The cartoon format allows these profound philosophical problems to be explored with a lightness and humor that makes them accessible rather than crushing, educational rather than paralyzing, thought-provoking rather than despair-inducing. The technological anxieties that emerge throughout our journey reflect our own fears about living in an age where artificial intelligence threatens to make human consciousness obsolete, where surveillance systems monitor our most private thoughts and behaviors, where virtual experiences compete with actual ones for psychological primacy, and where the boundary between natural and artificial becomes increasingly difficult to define or defend. Gumball's world serves as a testing ground for these concerns, allowing us to explore their implications in a context where the stakes feel manageable even when the questions being raised are ultimately matters of life and death. Meaning and meaninglessness, humanity and post-humanity, the relationship difficulties that characterize so much of Elmore's emotional landscape. the inability to communicate across difference, the tendency for love to become possessive and destructive, the challenge of maintaining individual identity within intimate connection, the struggle to accept change and growth in ourselves and others represent universal human challenges that transcend cultural and historical boundaries, while taking on particular intensity and complexity in our current moment of rapid social and technological transformation. As you drift towards sleep, let yourself imagine not the destruction and dysfunction we have witnessed, but the resilience and creativity that allows these characters to continue functioning despite circumstances that would crush less adaptable beings. Picture Gumball's irrepressible optimism in the face of repeated disappointment, Darwin's loyalty that transcends logic and self-interest, Anaïs's determination to understand and improve her world despite being too young to vote or drive or make most of her own decisions, Nicole's fierce protection of her family despite her own unmet needs and unexpressed desires, even Richard's ability to find joy and wonder in simple pleasures despite his obvious psychological limitations. Consider how these animated beings demonstrate that consciousness, however painful and however burdened with impossible questions and unsolvable problems, remains precious and worth preserving, that love, however flawed and however complicated by projection and possession, still represents the closest thing to transcendence that finite beings can achieve. That community, however dysfunctional and however maintained through collective denial, still offers forms of belonging and mutual support that make individual existence more bearable than it would be in complete isolation. Dream of families that find ways to love each other despite their limitations and misunderstandings, of communities that create space for difference and growth rather than demanding conformity and stagnation, of institutions that serve human needs rather than perpetuating their own existence, of technologies that enhance rather than replace human capabilities, of relationships that honor both connection and autonomy, both stability and change, both individual authenticity and collective responsibility. Rest now in the knowledge that tomorrow brings new possibilities for both cartoon cats and sleeping humans alike, that the sun will rise again over Elmore and over your own world, that consciousness will continue its eternal dance with unconsciousness, that love will persist despite its complications and transformations, that meaning will emerge from even the most chaotic and disturbing circumstances through the simple act of paying attention with compassion rather than judgment, with curiosity rather than fear, with hope rather than despair. Sweet dreams. And may your own world be a little less chaotic than the amazing world of Gumball, though perhaps no less filled with the strange beauty that emerges when consciousness encounters itself in all its infinite complexity and discovers that even in the darkest episodes, even in the most disturbing revelations about the nature of existence and relationship, there remains something worth protecting, something worth celebrating, something worth the effort it takes to remain awake and aware in a universe that offers no guarantees except the possibility of connection across the void and the promise that tomorrow might bring new forms of understanding that make today's struggles feel like necessary preparation for wisdom we cannot yet imagine, but might someday achieve through the accumulated experience of countless small acts of courage, kindness, and conscious choice.